recording is all started. Hello, everybody. All right. The topic is a great one today. It's one that's the linchpin of things for me, for a lot of implication for this and so forth, which is, and I think it's something that everyone wants to discuss more, given people that kind of know me and have been following along with the teaching and so forth. Then it all comes down to this. And it's what I listed as the foothold that we can have a couple webinars ago. And I talked about it some more last webinar, but there's a way that I think we can focus on it right now and have a number of great things to show you, I believe. And it's about the distinction between you and your brain. And when I say you and your brain, I don't worry about trying to distinguish between your brain and your mind. Whereas some books and some teaching that's where they look at. That's a wild goose chase. It's just not really important compared to the real distinction between you and your brain and mind and your whole self. Your body, brain, mind, soul, anything like that is one thing that you can think of as yourself. And then if it sounds like, and some things I'll say here I've said before, but there's still going to be plenty of new stuff too, or at least reasonably new. But if it looks like someone else or a book that you're reading or whatever, a certain philosophy is saying the same thing as we're saying here about you're not your mind, then try to put that on pause. Try not to project that. Whenever I see something that looks similar at first, it constantly ends up different than what I'm trying to say. So I'm worried that it'll interfere or right, you're getting this properly. And everything comes down to this distinction. If you get it, then the rest is downhill in a good way. And if you don't, then you have to keep working at it till you do, essentially. It's a critical distinction it opens up a whole new world for you. And I think I've alluded to, it's a little bit like if there's two people in a business and they're doing very different things and they have very different focuses, and that might even contradict if you try to put them in the same person, but it can work great. For example, if one person's teaching course content and another person's selling, then in one sense that can be helpful because when you're teaching, you're trying to think about what you're missing, what isn't. Ideally, you're thinking about what isn't working, about what you're explaining to people, things like that, so you can make things better, so you can break your students through and so forth. Generally true about product creation in general is you're trying to think about often what can make your product better, right? When you're selling, you don't quite, it's nice if you can capture that sense that someone else is focused on doing that if you're selling, but for yourself, you're trying to convey the certainty that the product is awesome, right? And when I watch people try to do both, and this is all just an illustration of how it can be very helpful to separate two things, right? At times, when I watch people try to do both, and certainly particularly with teaching, then they end up where they mostly are trying to sell themselves and believe their own BS, right? And believe that they're already totally an expert, don't need to improve, don't need to discover new things and so forth, because they need to be confident. It's all a circle, right? In their own head, they want to convey that certainty, which they then achieve basically by trying to not look at places where that might open up questions, right? You can see the same thing with pastors sometimes, right? They're trying to sell their philosophy in a sense, convert other people, which can be good and helpful, just like sales in a business can be. But if that makes them panic, if they question some of what they're believing or thinking, then that's counterproductive. Anyhow, the distinction between you and your brain can make life so much easier and can make success and winning and all that stuff so much easier. And learning, like we touched on last time, and it was a great illustration of along these same lines and pretty eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people. It was a great webinar last time in number 7. But I was saying that it can make things so much easier because what your brain is good at is one thing and its limitations are another, and we'll get to all that. So the bottleneck when it comes to your mind is one thing. The bottleneck when it comes to you is a different thing. And pretty much universally, people don't make this distinction. They make a different distinction that gets in the way of them making what would be a far more useful distinction. So the normal distinction is there's the conscious mind and subconscious mind, or parts of your mind, right? People will say, my heart is telling me this, but my brain is telling me such and such, or I'm conflicted, I want this or I want that. So their own mind will be split. and they'll make that type of distinction. It pops all over the place, right? Where it's one thing or another thing. It's their gut versus their whatever, and then also when there's certainty, then that's all the more invisible because when people tend to feel certain in a congruent way, then they especially don't check that over. They think that has to be right. A little bit like I've used, I think, the parallel in the past of one of the most dangerous things is when the Democrats and Republicans agree, right? That's when, unless they're right, okay? But if they agree on something where it's wrong, then there's particularly little chance of it getting fixed. Oh, and another place where people will make a distinction, but that's not in a place where it's useful to the degree of what we'll talk about today, is between the outside world, like the physical world, and then the world of their mind, right? Either abstract versus concrete world, or theory versus experiments, or just simply what's in their head versus what's out there in the real world or the external world. So these are all different types of distinctions. And they're all, those distinctions themselves can be understood much more properly if you get the real the real distinction that's at the bottom of it all. And so many things that are very practical and important can be cleared up when we make this distinction we're talking about today properly. And like I started with, one way of describing the benefit in general terms is that just like somebody who's selling a course versus someone who's teaching the course, it can be great to have two different people doing that because they can focus in different directions. In the person teaching the course, we want them to focus on what are they missing, what could be better, or the person making the product, right? Versus the people selling it just want to focus on the benefit and how it's already great and so forth. And that's merely an illustration. Of course, the same person could theoretically do both and quarantine nodes or have their mind be in different directions in different times in a way that's distinct and it's okay. But when it comes to you and your brain, it's unbelievably when you are able to see the distinction and look back and see what it's like not having and all the jumble and all the cross purpose stuff. What happens is you end up getting in the way of your brain consciously by accident, right? Interfering with learning is a real easy way to see it. And then we also then don't do what we need to do consciously, which is going to turn out to be seeing what doesn't matter, essentially. Let me go to a slide here. See what I have here. Okay. So I wrote something here. As you come to understand this, it won't be fully understandable unless I've explained things well enough for you in the past. It won't be fully understandable right off the bat, just reading it. But as you come to understand what's on the slide and how it works, then it's going to be a tremendous thing for you, life changing. And again, things are much easier because you get rid of the huge conflict that is very inefficient, like kind of two waves canceling each other out. And one last quick stab or rephrase or repeat of what happens if you don't have the distinction is you get in the way of your mind doing what it does well, and you don't do what you need to do consciously to help your brain when you don't distinguish. And because by default, what's going to happen is a person, a conscious being, thinks that they are their mind. And so the conscious being and what it can do get lost, essentially. And yet you start interfering with what your mind does well. Because when you're aware of something consciously, then you're putting the brakes on things, right? You've seen plenty of examples of this where I talked about this before, like with sword fighting, right? Where the idea is that, or with any kind of martial arts, you want to practice to the point where your body can respond on its own. Even swinging a bat, even baseball, you can't consciously register and hit a ball. It's not possible. You can just measure it, how long it would take the neurons even to do the signal that needed to happen, right? Neurons aren't consciousness, but presumably they need to fire off before you can even have a hope of reacting consciously. So basically hit the ball automatically, like subconsciously. It might feel like you're doing it consciously, it may not, but people can get involved consciously in a way that screws things up. And that's going on constantly in life as people are running into that inefficiency. But the inefficiency of interfering with your own brain is generally lesser inefficiency. That's the one people are more aware of, right? The idea that if people might say you're overthinking it, you're thinking too much, blah, blah, blah. That is inefficient, and it's going to be great to get rid of that, but it's of lesser importance than the massive inefficiency of not unsticking your brain properly and your mind. Okay, so what I wrote on the slide is that you and your mind have different bottlenecks. Of course, we're framing this whole series strategy in life and success in general as being unstuck and focusing on breaking bottlenecks, right? You do that, everything else will take care of itself. But the lack of this distinction, it means that you don't have the foothold when it comes to understanding life and how it basically fundamentally works and how you interact with your own mind and therefore the world, and therefore all your results, all your thinking, all your success. The fundamental bottleneck is not having the right distinction to have the right foothold with it. So in one manner of speaking, so once we understand to look for bottlenecks, then it turns out that what we're talking about in this webinar is maybe arguably, maybe not, probably not arguably, once we got particular clarity on it. This is the most basic bottleneck. And once I got over this, once I became aware of this distinction, then it opened up the whole world that became law of implication. And so for me, and the practical benefits are enormous in every area of life. Okay. So I wrote that you and your mind have a different bottleneck, which isn't noticeable unless you distinguish, meaning that unless you have the distinction we're talking about in this webinar, you won't be aware, you won't notice that the two different bottlenecks properly, and therefore won't address them. And your life is just basically fundamental bottleneck and trying to move through quicksand or whatever. And then I describe the two different bottlenecks, the one that your mind has and the one, and again, I don't worry about brain versus mind. That's like a wild goose chase. It's not important. For your brain, the issue is, and this is the problem. Your brain is really good at what it does, but it has one massive limitation, that it isn't a weakness. It's like a full block. It can't do it on its own. For your brain, the issue is getting stuck, believing that something is true, which also means matches up when it isn't true or when it doesn't match up. I'll illustrate that in a moment. Let's read the rest of the slide. Whoops. Oh, and then this phrase will indicate the bottleneck that you have as a conscious being trying to interact with your mind and therefore the rest of the world. So you're trying to use your free will, et cetera, whatever it is, your direct power that you have over the world to presumably make it better for yourself, right? Then your bottleneck is that, see, as we tease apart this distinction, we'll come to understand that you don't process information at all. We're so used to thinking of our mind as part of ourselves, which is then us, right? Basically identifying with our mind, that we think that we process information. We as us, the kind of conscious being, the one who's experiencing our consciousness field. But you do not and cannot process information. So that's a little red flag. Whenever you accidentally start to meander into using an idea of you, and I don't say yourself because can use the terminology self to refer to your mind, your brain, and your body, basically your mind, right? Your kind of brain and your body and mind all blend into one thing that all works as together and blend together. That's where information gets processed. So whenever one way that we start to tease apart this distinction is we want to come to think that, and our common language that I have to use to talk to each other, I talk to you, is filled with terms that are a little bit ambiguous or vague when it comes to what I'm talking about. Don't worry, it'll all work. Sometimes you can find a meaning of something I'll say. I can't refer to you and yourself and your brain and your mind without sometimes using words that could be interpreted to mean the other one or whatever. But it fundamentally won't block us from talking. If I ever seem to be saying something wrong, I'll just correct it in your mind, just interpret it the right way. So you don't process information. And so you need things to be simple, interestingly. You're aware of a certain amount of information. If you weren't, you'd be aware of nothing, right? The opposite of being aware of something would either be nothing or everything. You're neither all-knowing, but neither also are you not conscious at all, which I've said before. And it's one of the infinite many illustrations of what we're going to learn to do consciously. And in terms of helping our brain get unstuck and seeking truth and all that stuff is I thought of the illustration of Perseus. I think it was him that killed the Medusa. And of course he looked through a mirrored shield, right? So her gaze wouldn't turn him to stone. It's going to turn out that to see truth or to do your part to help your brain clear up issues and incorrect things that it has matched up and so forth, then you're going to need to back your way into it. But if you think of yourself as Perseus looking at the Medusa through a mirrored shield, then it can help keep reminding you, because you're going to constantly have the instinct to do it wrong. You're going to constantly be drawn because your mind does this. It's what it's there for. But your mind looks at stuff and tries to make like order out of chaos. And it tries to make certainty out of uncertainty, reality out of things that are not really foundational, out of the inputs that it gets. And so it tries to match things up and associate. Literally what your mind is a bunch of, your brain is, in this case, is a bunch of associations, literally, right? Some inhibitions, right? You can have neurons that inhibit things, but it's associations. So it's going to keep drawing you back into trying to see what does matter. And we want to come to understand that better and let it do that, but not get caught up in it. It basically, when your mind needs to make its best guess, it's good at making its best guess from a ton of information and from stuff that you can't know for sure. Just like when you look around the physical world, imagine you're your mind for a second. To do that, you have to imagine being non-conscious for a moment, which in one sense you can't do, but in another sense, try, because you can, it's like being blind or a certain thing. But regardless, it just gets input. And if we think of it just simply, we usually, it's easy to narrow it down to like your eyes, let's say, or we could do your ears, whatever. Let's do ears for a change, right? Your ears are getting a bunch of sound waves, right? Different differentials and like air pressure or whatever, or waves. And then what are those doing? It affects different cilia differently, right? Is that it? Or something with the eardrum? I'm not an expert on that, but I think there's different hairs to different frequencies that then stimulate neurons, right? Which then send electrical signals. Those get processed and so forth. I might have that a little bit off, but the principle is going to be something like that. The same with sight, right? There's different frequencies of light will interact with molecules first in your retina, and then that will set off receptors and set off impulses and so forth. So what are your ears or your auditory system dealing with? What is your visual system dealing with? It's dealing with, in one sense, a very chaotic set of just different frequencies, right? And from that, it ends up doing a bunch of processing that God gets involved, right? To make a conscious field itself. Your brain can't actually make a consciousness field, but it ends up forming the reasons why you see what you hear, which doesn't feel like a chaotic bunch of photons or sound wave, right? You get an experience that feels real and that feels coherent, right? Which is awesome. Once you take the brain and the mind for what it's supposed to do, that's terrific that it does. You wouldn't be any better off if you just, as a matter of fact, you'd be much worse off if you just saw chaotic, like what amounts to like static, right? Like a whole bunch of just uninterpreted signals or whatever. So that's what your brain needs to do. And your brain can process an extraordinary amount of information. It's good at that. It doesn't have much of a bottleneck with processing a ton of information or learning a ton of information. When people blend this distinction that I'm trying to make for you between you and your brain together, they get all confused about learning. And when I say confused, it's the normal state of people's understanding of learning is screwed up. Where even Sherlock Holmes, obviously a fictional character, but Conan Doyle quoted Holmes as talking about how like the mind is like an attic and he doesn't want to have it cluttered with irrelevant information. Right? He found out something like that the earth revolves around the sun or something like that. And he said, oh, I'll immediately try to forget that because I don't want to clutter my mind with irrelevant information. But actually, I love Sherlock Holmes. It's great stuff. You can learn a lot about thinking and so forth from reading Doyle. But that is an example of like a popularly known example of a misconception about learning. As a matter of fact, the more you learn, the more you can learn. It gives you more of a framework, right? Retrieval can be screwed with if you have too much clutter in the wrong way that's disorganized, sure. And if you have too many inputs at once, sure, your mind needs to figure out what's important. Although if it thinks that a whole bunch of it is important, it'll record it all. Anyway, in a way that you can retrieve it. So the mind and the brain doesn't really have a bottleneck when it comes to complexity or amount of information. It can process a tremendous amount of information and do it well, very well in its own way. But you consciously are really aware of very little. If you, again, if you stop and think about it in a certain way where you're not confusing yourself with your brain, then if you try to think what you're really aware of right now, then first of all, a little confusing, right? Because you're making the mistake of not being Perseus. You're trying to think, what is it? What do you know rather than what don't you? But one way or the other, you certainly aren't able to process or not even process, but just be aware or think about or be conscious of in a way that's useful. You might think maybe I'm conscious of so much information right now. If I look around and I see all the grass, or I look out my window or trees or people, but you're not really, if you think of looking at a crowd of people, there's a way that you're not really conscious of a lot of detail, right? Or the various people, like one thing will pop, you'll be aware of, or another like aspect, you're kind of aware of of seeing a bunch of people, right? And there's all sorts of experiments where people don't like notice, even like someone could come into a classroom wearing a gorilla suit, and they've done experiments where if there's something else people are paying attention to, they don't even know. Now, part of that is the mind registering it and not deleting it. But then it also shows though that if they think that they were consciously aware of what was going on in the room, it wasn't like that. Like all the stuff that they thought they were conscious of, they weren't really conscious of. Yeah. Their mind didn't bring it to their attention, but their mind wouldn't have had to bring it to their attention if they were conscious of it in some other way as well. So when it comes to doing whatever it is we do consciously, which I'll tell you, I know what that is, but just for a moment to put it that way. One thing we're going to need to do, it's going to have to be very simple, right? Because again, we don't process information at all. And the amount of information we're even aware of is very, maybe it's 7 things, maybe it's, or distinctions, or who knows, maybe it's not. But it's something where it's some kind of handful, maybe 20, maybe whatever. But it's not like thousands of bits of information or distinctions that we're not consciously aware of at a time. So again, your bottleneck as a conscious being is that things need to be very simple in one sort of way for you to do what you do, but not to do. And again, this distinction is probably something maybe something you're still working on. So as I talk, it won't, don't look for it to feel totally distinct yet. We get to that by just talking to each other. Sorry. So I was saying that consciously, you need things to be simple to do what you do. Your brain doesn't need things to be exactly simple for it to do what it does. And one thing that I can bring you to, that's a question a lot of people have, is when do we trust our own minds? When do we trust our gut? When do we trust our first impression? Aren't there studies that the first impression tends to be better than like our second guess, once we second guess ourselves and so forth? And I don't disagree with that. That seems to what the studies are saying. And it actually fits in with what I'm talking about here, is that when your brain is doing what it does, we're just making its best guess out of a gray area. Right? I use the idea of a gray area when we don't know whether something's whether something's totally true or what the exact right answer is. We're at a gathering. Who do we go talk to first? There's 20 people there. That's an example of a gray area in many cases. It might not be for other reasons, but if that's the only information you have and you just look around, you don't know for exact certain which person that you might talk to that will lead you to the worst result in the future. And you don't know for sure which person will lead you to the best result in the future, right? So it's a gray area. Or if you're just trying to remember something and you're not quite sure if you remember it correctly, do you second guess your impression or not? And so going with your brain's impression in those cases is perfectly appropriate. But then, what do I do besides that, David? Do I just, obviously life can't consist of just going with your impulse at all times, right? But worrying when there's a gray area, fretting, right? Like worrying or fretting. That's what you just want to, you can cut that out of your life. It's like people put so much of their like emotional effort, conscious attention, and trying to solve problems and so forth. And what I'm telling you now is probably making a lot of sense, or feels like it's about to make some sense, and it's practical, and that's correct. So in this webinar, we're trying to understand this distinction, this deep and a very critical distinction. But also what I'm saying now is pretty tangible for at least for a moment. And if you think it's tangible, it is. You're going to be able to apply this probably regardless of how perfectly you immediately understand the rest of the distinction. So we put a lot of thinking, what we call thinking, but emotional effort, attention and stuff into trying to like metaphorically squint at issues like that, right? Oh, who do I talk to? Or just where do I go to college, right? Do I take this job or not? and it's like a tough choice and you're not sure what to do. That's the wrong place to look. Your mind is going to do its best job but it has its one bottleneck and you want to address that one bottleneck instead of looking through your brain's eyes, so to speak, and getting involved with what it's trying to do. Because all you'll do there is just come up the gears and you're not going to help it the way it needs to be helped. Your brain isn't like a child, but the parallel or metaphor of how you might deal with a child or your child can help you with this distinction. When you're trying to help a child, you want to clear the way for them, right? You want to compensate for what they're not good at. But let's say a child is trying to learn. If you get agitated and try to push them to learn faster, they're already good at learning, right? You're not going to help them learn by getting consciously involved with their learning in the sense of, do you know the answer? What's this answer? You're testing them and you're pushing or agitated yourself or nervous. It's pretty easy to see how both that's reasonably common for people to do with kids, right? To get impatient with them or whatever. But also it's pretty easy to see when we're not in the middle of it, how that's counterproductive. And that's a great parallel for what you don't want to do with your own mind. And it's fairly easy to see when it comes to yourself and a child. It's a great illustration because you can see doing it, but also see not doing it, right? And that you can do both. What I mean is in real life, you can get sucked into doing it this is what I meant by doubling down in the sense of what your brain's doing. If you're in the wrong way identified with your child and kind of impatient and wanting to get them to learn something, it's only going to mess them up, right? On the other hand, if you're able to step away, look at the situation and help clear out bottlenecks that can be messing with them. As a matter of fact, they could be getting agitated and you could say, it's okay, take your time, right? Now that could help, right? So you can make them more agitated by getting wrongly associated with them at the wrong time. But you can, by distinguishing between you and your child and the different bottlenecks that they have versus what you can help them with. And you don't want to get agitated by their bottlenecks, right? Where you basically, again, don't help them and make it worse. And so same thing with people's and their own minds. What this distinction is fundamentally invisible to people because they're getting their thinking and their thoughts from their mind. And their mind is itself. That's just like A equals A, right? Your mind equals your mind. Your mind is your mind. So what does your mind tell you that you are? Your mind. Because your mind is your mind. But when you really get that, what I just said, and you might have already gotten it's kind of eye-opening, fascinating, really cool, something. But your mind thinks it's itself because it is. So when your mind is doing your thinking for you, it's all from the perspective of your mind as itself. So it's going to constantly draw you in. And you can get drawn into your mind, just like you can get involved and associated with your child, and that can be appropriate. But it's not appropriate if your child is hitting a bottleneck. And it's not appropriate if you're making the bottleneck worse and getting agitated. That needs to be a red flag to step back mentally and so forth, and then associate back with yourself as the parent and help to address the bottleneck as a parent appropriately and wisely. And you're going to want to do this. Well, you can do the same thing in your life with your own mind. And if you do that, you'll be quite unique. It can look like people do this. They do an approximation of it sometimes, but they just associate with a different aspect of their mind or their self when they do it. That's their kind of crutch or their approximation. But there's plenty of bottlenecks you can't break just by associating with a different part of your mind because none of your mind is conscious. You are conscious of your consciousness field. There's a part of your mind that's actively involved with what you're aware of, but none of your mind itself, none of the processing is conscious. Just like none of the CPU of a computer is aware of the screen. Some of the processing of your computer is responsible for what shows up on the screen. And we could distinguish that processing and that the type of memory or processing that's responsible for what shows up on the screen. We could distinguish that from stuff on your computer or disk space or processing that's not responsible for what's showing up on the screen right now. There could be programs or applications running in the background that don't show up on the screen right now. But that's a great illustration to show what I mean by none of your mind is conscious, even if some of your mind is involved with what's showing up for you consciously right now. Just like with a computer, none of your computer is aware of what's on the computer screen, even though some of it is involved with what shows up on the computer. So just associating with a different part of your mind is not going to be enough. So what do? What we want to do is get a good sense of what our brain runs into and why. And don't worry if I say brain or mind, unless I point out that I'm using one term on purpose. I just use them interchangeably for the sake of this discussion. What I want to do is show you how and why, what's going on with your brain doing its version of matching, which is associating. Like the illustration of language, if I were to point at your iPhone or your laptop or whatever, let's just take the example of an iPhone, and I were to say, is that an iPhone? And you would correctly say, yeah, right? But if I were to point out something different, then you would get to the point where you actually say no. If I were to say, is the symbol, like the sound, or is the word iPhone, does it exactly match that like device in your hand? No, one's like a symbol, right? Like the letters iPhone, IPHONE, or the sound of the symbol, whatever the sound that we make when we say it. The sound does not match the letters, which doesn't, and the letters, even conception or mind, don't match the actual physical written letters exactly. And when I say match, obviously a sound can't match a vision, right? And neither of them is exactly the same as a device. And that's the same as any word, right? Whatever a word is referring to, like a tree, right? The actual tree, whatever that might be, but if we just think of it in the simple idea of a tree, right? Just like the plant. That's not the same as a symbol, obviously, if we stop and realize what we mean. But normally we'll just say, is that a tree? And say, yeah. Is that an iPhone? Yeah. So to your mind and to you, it feels like those are one and the same. The word and the device are associated or matched up, and yet they obviously don't actually match in a different sense. But I point that out to show how it's useful and necessary for your brain to take things that actually don't match and associate them as a match. Just if you look at yourself, another person, the same person, pick a person, a friend of yours. Every time you see them, they look different, right? And as a matter of fact, in other ways, they're different too, right? Their cell, right? Their body, different skin cells, right? Different. Their brain would have had different connections than the previous day, just by a little bit or whatever, right? They could have cut their hair. Of course, you're visually seeing them in a different angle and different position. And your brain matches all those into one person, right? Creates one kind of category or word, right? Or concept, whatever, but one kind of placeholder for that friend of yours. And of course, puts their name with it. And then all the different stuff with them gets associated with that as one thing. So your mind makes one thing out of many things, right? All the different visual experiences you have with a person. And then it could put their actions all in kind of one conglomerate idea of a person or a self for that person. And this helps you to navigate the world. And it is, remember, what is your bottleneck? Fundamentally, you're you, not yourself, not your mind, your brain or whatever, not your body. So this is all about you ultimately. Like the world is about conscious being happy, right? So it's all built for conscious being. It's not the same as just saying it's all built for humans or not, right? But if something isn't a conscious being, then it's not relevant ultimately. What I mean is the world's only made for things that are conscious. Anything that's not conscious, it has no experience, has no feelings. There's no meaning there fundamentally, except as it relates to a conscious being. So meaning arises from the experiences of conscious beings, whoever those conscious beings might, or whatever those conscious beings might be attached to, whatever bodies, selves. So it's about that. Remember, what's your bottleneck is you don't process information. I know some people might be saying, how do you know that? I've addressed that in the past. Remember, the way to address any of it is you look at the opposite. And there's just a simple proof for that, which is to process information, you need all sorts of other qualities, and you'd have to change. You have to be a sort of thing that could process information. So just assuming that you have all those qualities is ridiculous. You build your understanding of your existence, you, from the fact that you're aware, right? The conscious field itself is your foothold, the fact that you have one, and then whatever you know about it. So since you have one, there's a you that's having one, period. So you don't just get to arbitrarily add on other stuff unless you discover it. And if it was the case, so the burden of proof is on the person thinking that you have all sorts of other stuff. The idea that you can also process information would be something you wouldn't add it on to a quality that you have unless you could build it. But if you try to build it, it doesn't add up. And plus anything like that has to have qualities where it just has to have all sorts of further features in order to process information. You need to be able to get inputs, do something to those inputs, make outputs, and which means it needs to be able to like change and adapt. And if you accept inputs, like the visual system of yourself, when it accepts like visual information, part of it changes, right? Like the retina, there's chemical reactions going. So it moves. To process, something has to move and do stuff, or do the equivalent of moving. I'm having to use terms that are poorly understood, but just to be simple for now, just based on the general understanding of the world. And something that moves changes, which means that there's so many mistakes people have about how the world works. They think that there is such a thing as motion, which there isn't, not externally. There's the appearance of such in your consciousness field. And there's such a thing as the concept of it as a model, as a representation which works in a lot of cases until it doesn't. But something that can process information is complex. It moves, it have to change. Anything that changes is no longer itself. It no longer exists. It went away and there's something new. A thing can't actually change. In order to have change, you need, in essence, like a whole complex structure that enables you need a whole being and mind that can imagine things that the way people normally think of change is inherently contradictory to the issue. It's like something is different and still the same, right? Just to put it simple. But something can't be both different and the same. That's the contradiction. This is all understandable, but I started to go down that route just to illustrate where you end up if you start to just start, why can't I process information? If you want to understand that, then you get there by understanding other things first. And I just went down that road a little while to give you an indication of what it looks like to go down that road. But you can't just skip over to it and just go on BS on to who you are, is what I meant. I was giving you a sense of that it's complicated enough. It's not ultimately that hard to understand, but it certainly isn't like one step of logic. And as a matter of fact, it's incorrect. It ends up being false, that you as a being is something that can process information. And again, the simple punchline there is that to process information, it has to be something that is complex, can change, and something that changes is no longer the same thing. So you would have to be dying every second and being replaced with something entirely different, in which case you wouldn't be you. So it all falls apart. So I was saying it's all about you as a conscious being. So things need to be simple for you, but the world that God needed to make in order for us to have free will, love, interact with other people and so forth is complex relative to what we can handle as conscious beings. And so we have something to help with that greatly. And that's our brain and our mind and to interface with it and everything in our body. And so what it does is it takes this complexity and makes it relatively simple and really even simpler than people suspect, because your brain gives you conclusions every second, right? It gives you a sense of certainty that things are correct. When you see a couch or computer, that is a computer, like you feel a conclusion. It's just so natural, you hardly even notice it's happening. But you don't look at a computer and feel like it's a bird. You feel like it's a computer, which is a conclusion. Imagine if you hypnotize somebody, right? Theoretically, you could hypnotize someone to look at a bird and feel that it's a computer. Right? I think that's within the realm of what a stage hypnotist even could do. You see what I mean? So then they would look at a bird and feel sure it's a computer, right? So it would be an incorrect conclusion, which would make it much easier to see what I mean by you're giving conclusions all the time. Those conclusions simplify things for you. You can just exercise free will inside of those conclusions. Just like if you're a president and you're of a company or country, whatever, and you're given advisors, you could make choices within what your advisors tell you, but you'd be limited to their choices that they let you have and whatever lies they want to. So in one sense, you're making choice, but it's within a box that is defined for you. If that box didn't allow for enough goodness, or if it allowed any bad, then you wouldn't want to have to stay in that box, right? So in one sense, you'd be using free will, but it would be so limited, right? That you'd want to get out of it. So on a day-to-day level, with whatever issues that you're working on right now, problems you're trying to solve, things you're trying to create, success you're trying to have, growth you're trying to have, relationships you're trying to deal with in whatever way, how do you use what I'm telling you? And I say that by way of further explaining. I don't think that it's necessarily crystal clear for people at all yet, but I'm asking that in order to further explain. What you want to do is your brain, the only way that it can find out that the break in association that it has, have a paradigm shift, so to speak, or even a minor thing where it learns something new that's different from what it thought was the case before, is if it has an experience where we could say that it experiences, you'll probably experience it along with it. It doesn't experience, it's not in a conscious way, but where your brain, your body, yourself encounters expectation failure, or it can have you can have, without you consciously exercising this kind of out of the box, in a good way, free will, change can happen through, it can be imposed upon yourself by the environment, either with expectation failure that's strong enough. Like at first, your mind will try to delete and marginalize the expectation failure, right? If there's things that happen that you like somebody, you think they're super duper, and you're incentivized to like them for whatever reason, they're sleeping with you, or they're buying something from you, or they're a good contact, or they're just good looking, or they remind you of someone else, or whatever. One way or the other, you are incentivized, right, to like them. And then if they do things that might be sketchy in somebody else, then at first your mind will try deleting and marginalizing, right? Deciding it's not important, the little things, anomalies. Not like at some point, and this is I'm illustrating here the way that change can happen outside of your free will. So you can also see why you're going to need your free will. But I also want you to see how it can happen sometimes without you. So you don't want to mistake what I'm describing for you exercising your free will. It can look like you are, but it's not it. At some point, the environment can change, or expectations cannot be met to a degree where pretty much it'll change the goal itself. It'll almost have to get to where your mind no longer wants to the person, in a sense, or believe a certain thing for whatever reason. But one way or the other, the environment can impose such huge anomalies that can no longer be ignored. Or again, I think what really happens is just that goal changes. Like people could pretty much believe anything, no matter how ridiculous and no matter how strongly someone is saying the most reasonable things to the opposite. We'll close the conversation. How with my mom the other night. But anyway, we'll go to that. So maybe what it needs to happen is the incentive for the belief needs to change, right? So basically the standards and norms change, or people get around different people, right? A different peer group or a different environment, one way or the other, where different goals become relevant to believe different things. Then the mind can change something that it believes and such. It can change an association that it previously had associated as true or matched up, or an assumption with that. But that's outside of your control. Like that method is outside of your control. It can feel like again, your mind will tell itself, and it'll tell you that you're it, right? And it'll tell itself that it's the one deciding to change, and it's its own intelligence and so forth, right? But it was basically imposed upon it. As we can see, just looking around in the world, perhaps in ourselves and so forth, that doesn't cover everything that needs to be covered by any stretch. And so what we want to do, and this is a restatement of stuff I said in the past at this point a little bit, is like I talked about, of course, narrowing down the gray area, right? What can you shave off that's definitely incorrect or definitely correct, but you get to it definitely correct typically by seeing that the opposite can't be correct. If you're walking into a room and trying to decide who to talk to, just to use a bit of a trivial example, but just to make this tangible, suppose that there's an attractive member of a gender that you're attracted to, right? In the room. It can feel like that's the person you want to talk to, right? You hope that, because you might get even a double benefit. Maybe there'll be a good business contact, but plus they're attractive. Now, where's that feeling coming from? What's interesting is that's coming from an old trigger, like something getting triggered in your mind, where for other reasons, your mind associates benefit, progress, right? Pleasure, but because of progress, right? Your mind basically gives you pleasure for some things that it thinks is going to make progress for you, whether or not it's correct about that. Then that old association will get triggered, even if it's not relevant for the situation. And you can feel like spending time focused on that person. So that's an old kind of matching. It's an old association that your mind has that isn't necessarily relevant for this setting, but it got triggered. How do you interact with your mind to help not have it do matching something up that shouldn't be matched up? I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong that the talk to the person is necessarily wrong, but what you want to do is figure out what can you know, and you can carry forward in your mind the scenario of what am I looking to have happen? Where is it going to lead if I talk to this person? Suppose you're married but you feel a feeling like I hope this person's attracted to me. Not like you'll necessarily cheat with the person or not, but you could even let's say you have an impulse like, well, I want them to be attracted to me. But you can even, if you carry forward that scenario, it can potentially start to reveal a contradiction. And I don't care about, I'm not trying to make a statement about flirting or adultery or any of this stuff. I'm just pick this as an example and I'm just carrying it through. So I'm not trying to make a point about the subject matter, just overall concept of how to interact with your mind. If you go through the scenario, if they're attracted to me, where's that going to lead? I guess I could feel good, but that's only circular, right? As a matter of fact, this actually reminds me so that I might want to work on that association itself. Why would I want to feel good and feel motivated? Especially if it's a business setting and here I am motivated to do something that has nothing to do with furthering my business goal. And then will it further my life goals in other ways? Having someone show interest in you might actually make you do a little bit less for your own husband or wife or whatever, or that if I stipulate you're married. That person might be with someone else even there that you might piss off. Maybe it's the head of the group, right? By appearing to flirt with a person or show interest that you shouldn't. You might want to so that's something you might want to find out, right? When you start to carry through the scenario of where it can lead, it might still be a fine idea to talk to the person, but you might realize, oh, wait a second. And so it's carrying to the scenario that I'm illustrating here. What you're doing is, what's interesting is that your brain won't necessarily do that by itself. There's something I've said in multiple times, but I think that it's not necessarily easy to adopt and to feel. And that is that once you think something through, but by carrying through the scenario of where it's going to lead, what's the actual point? Your mind gives you an impulse. I want to do such and such. Okay, why? And what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? What's the real benefit? How's it going to play out? When you do that, in this example illustration I've given you, there's all sorts of potential pitfalls, distractions, a zillion different problems that could come about from flirting, even if it's not overt flirting, but hoping, flirting with someone at this business meeting. Again, you could piss off someone else. You could demotivate yourself regarding your own relationship. You could create a love triangle that feels good for a few days and then creates a real shitstorm for whatever. Usually, anyway, when you think it through, you might think, okay, that's obvious after you do it. But what I had said in the past and what I'm reiterating here is that when you think something through with a scenario like that, the result of it, even if it seems obvious, is not something your brain realized previously. A little bit like the iPhone example, where I stopped and I said, wait a second, does the symbol iPhone, the sound of the word, the written word, does it actually match the machine or the visual experience of the iPhone or whatever, right? Obviously not. But before I asked that question, it just fully felt that, yeah, that's an iPhone, that like iPhone, the symbol matches the device, the thing that you hold in your hand, the visual experience, they all match in a certain way, right? So it's a big realization when this fully hits you, and it might have already hit you, but it might not have. When it fully hits you, even the fear video where I talk about carrying through the scenario regarding fear, I made this point, right? Is that even if it's obvious after you think through what'll happen after the event of your fear, where after your mind got stuck, and it wasn't obvious to your brain at all. Your brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't work through scenarios in the way that you can do. And it doesn't see that things don't match unless it doesn't. Of course, your mind can sometimes see that things don't match all by itself. Obviously, you don't look at your house and your car and think that they match, right? I'm not saying that, but your mind you can imagine a person going to a networking meeting or something, or a place where they might meet people that could be helpful, even a hobby, even going to a bowling league, right? And you're meeting people that they might have friends and referrals that might help you with your business. If the mind sees an attractive member of a gender that you're interested in, it can feel that association, or that feeling, yeah, I want to talk to that person. And it isn't, even though it's obvious if you compare it to the scenarios that there's no good outcome to that. And I'm not saying in every case, I'm just saying that if we stipulate the circumstances where there actually isn't a good outcome, it can not be obvious, right? When your mind does match something up, does make an association, does have an assumption, then it isn't by itself, without a significant environmental change or whatever or happening that's outside of your control. It's not going to see that doesn't, or else people would never feel afraid, frustrated, angry. When someone's angry or frustrated, let's say frustrated in particular, anger at least has the theoretical thing that maybe if you're angry at someone, that might cause them to behave differently, and that might do something. When you're frustrated at objects, right? And that's pretty much never. So like yelling at your computer is not going to be productive in pretty much any situation. But it can feel like your mind, it can feel not feel, your mind could process and come to the conclusion that frustration is the most effective reaction to a certain happenstance. That couldn't happen, even though it's totally obvious if you look at the situation the right way, not the most effective response, right? Frustration, right? Very easy to come up with. I won't even bother. It's very easy to come up with a scenario where a person gets frustrated, and one that'll happen in real life, in reality, right? That's common. They get frustrated. And then at the same time, that same scenario, you look at it and it's easy to see how that's not the most effective response. And yet the mind still does it. If the mind could see that things don't match, even if they're obvious to you consciously, once you think that to the scenario, and then you communicate it to your mind in a way that your mind can see it. But once you get involved consciously with your mind, it can become obvious. It wasn't obvious or even possible for your mind to see it without you getting consciously involved. And trying to make sure you see what I'm saying here with the frustration. Your mind, when it gets frustrated, is trying to achieve a goal. By logic, it's trying to achieve the goal in the most efficient and effective manner, right? There's no such thing as like intentionally trying to be ineffective regarding something that you are trying to do. You could be intentionally ineffective about something that you're trying to be ineffective about. But if you're pursuing a goal to where you become frustrated in the first place, obviously that means that your mind's going after a goal, or it wouldn't be frustrated, right? And then there's an obstacle that wasn't expected. It seems unnatural. So your mind might get frustrated. And then you feel frustrated. It gives you a conclusion. You are frustrated. But there's an inherent contradiction there. That technique, that response of being frustrated, your mind is asserting that matches the most effective strategy for achieving your goal, right? Because again, it obviously is trying to achieve that goal that you're frustrated about. And then right then it's giving you the activity of being frustrated. So it's trying to do it, and it's giving you the activity to do in order to do it, which is be frustrated. Obviously that doesn't match, but also obviously your mind thinks it matches, or else it wouldn't be making you feel frustrated. And we can give example after example. I can do examples for years, because they're just constantly this is what minds do, is they do what they do well, and then they get stuck. They get stuck thinking that things match in a way that it's super easy for you to see if you get consciously involved that they don't match, but it's not, but your mind by itself doesn't see it. Because it's so easy, when you get consciously involved, you feel like it's easy. And so you don't think you did anything special. And then you think, oh, I'll just do it like it's easy. Again, so your brain, and then you tell your mind just thinks it's easy that it can do it. So you get consciously involved with your mind. You do what you can do when you're consciously involved. You unstick it. But then by accident, without realizing it, your mind thinks that it's it, and that it can do it any time. but can't. So what you want to do is look for this phenomenon of when your mind is getting stuck. Believing means you're acting on something, which also means you're thinking as if it's true, right? You're thinking and acting as if it's true. That's what a belief is. It's beliefs manifest themselves as thought and action. And there's no belief until there's thought. So your mind has an association and believes it matches, believes it's true, and it doesn't match, such as getting frustrated as the best technique for efficiently and effectively achieving a goal. That doesn't match, that never matches, that I can think of. But your mind thinks it does fairly often, probably, right? Or at least sometimes, or in the past it has, and we can see it in other people. That's when you need to get consciously involved. But you get consciously involved by doing something that results in your mind noticing in its way, noticing, which means you'll feel the distinction. When your mind notices something, it'll give you a feeling that it notices it, where it doesn't match. Just like with the iPhone example with the symbols, right? In the iPhone, there's a point in which you felt, oh, that doesn't match. The symbol doesn't match the device. And that's all. That's the entire process. It's all contained in that one in that one illustration. What's going to happen is you're going to have red flags. The fundamental red flag is just bad feeling of some sort, any kind of badness. Somewhere, something doesn't match and your brain thinks it does. You consciously might not know what that thing is either, but then you work with your brain, and you do what I talked about, working through scenarios, start to look for a foothold of what's one thing that doesn't match. You take things to the extreme, so you at least see something. Just these simple techniques for making clarity more distinct. Anything that makes that brings starts to bring distinctions, including building something that you can notice, even if it's extreme and not immediately helpful. This idea that you are not your brain is an example of that, where it's not necessarily immediately helpful, but you need it as a stepping stone to get to where you need to be in the moment, like what feels immediately relevant to you in your life right now. Obviously, figuring out whether the distinction between you and your brain is not the number one thing that most people are generally working on in the moment. They don't feel like that. If someone had 3 wishes from a genie, they wouldn't say my first wish is to distinguish between myself and my brain. So you guys at this point, I wish I could tell what David said. But anyhow, it's not like the end result. It's not the final thing that's immediately going to get you your payoff, right? But it's a critical foothold. And you need to I bring that up because you need to get used to seeing progress, right? You want to even feel it, which means it's like a habit, which means it's easier. It becomes default, but it's easier. You want to get to the point where the right thing feels right. It's easier than the right thing feeling wrong. You start sometimes with the right thing feeling wrong, with the feeling right. That's why we have our quarantine that we talked about. Quarantine, like we figured out what actually is right. But then over time, you get to where it feels more, what is right feels more and more right. So as part of a journey, a person will feel like they're making progress when they start to see distinctions that may help them as building blocks or stepping stones to where they're trying to get to. And you need to kind of embrace that, where you don't have to figure out the answer that you want, solve the problem all in one step. If you don't feel progress from making distinctions that can help clear things up, then you're going to get locked out. People that need to have it all, like the answer in the moment, it's like someone that needs to learn and feel a sense of closure immediately when they're learning, they'll get locked out of learning because like they can't learn unless they can learn immediately, right? Or they can't go on to the next video or the next sentence. They need to keep pausing it because they need to feel like they already understood what the person said. Even with me, right? If you feel like you already have to have understood what I'm saying here, then that'll be a block. That'll interfere with you eventually understanding what I'm saying. And the only path to understanding what I'm trying to build for you here may be steps, right? You may need to make some distinction first that aren't immediately what you want. They're not this distinction here if you're trying to get it, right? The difference between you and your brain. you might need to make some distinctions along the way, even once I've talked, right? I don't have anything else in mind, but right, you might need to build up to it. And why do I keep talking? Right, where I'm giving you ingredients, I'm giving you potential stepping stones and different angles and so forth. If you can't accept that, if you're too impatient, right, if you need to get it all in one jump, then you may never get there. It's like trying to jump a chasm that's too far for you to jump physically. The only way to do it would be to build a bridge, which might take a bunch of steps, right? So you have to feel like building the bridge or making the stepping stones, whatever. It has to feel like progress. And so good. Okay, let's see here. All right. Let's see if there's any progress you made here about talking about simplifying. I wrote about simplifying cause and effect. I haven't addressed that. I talked about previously about how we can think of what we're talking about together, law of implication, stop crushing the game, as getting better at navigating through the future, right? Much like we're pretty good at navigating around in 3 dimensions. We don't bump into trees. We can walk out the door, drive a car, and so. But we're a lot worse at navigating into the future, where by thinking and representing decisions and how things will turn out, and what to say, what to do, getting the results that we want is something that we're obviously fairly imperfect at, and that the better we are at it, the better off we are, and everyone happier, better results, better relationships, everything's better, right? Better basically is equivalent to navigating the future better, because you're obviously trying to navigate to good stuff in the future. The better you can navigate to good stuff and away from bad stuff, then the more good stuff you'll have, the less bad. So we can look at this all in the backdrop of navigating better into the future. And remember, and it's you doing it. You have your brain and your mind to help you. So we want to set up your brain and your mind properly. But the buck stops with you as a conscious being. So for you, you have to simplify. And one way of thinking of navigating into the future is it's all about cause and effect, right? It all boils down to, in one way of looking at it, what do you do in order to get a result that will then be something that you want in order to get a next result, and so forth, right? Cause and effect. But complexity is unhelpful for us as conscious beings. We ultimately want to have things that are simple that we can hang our hat on or whatever. From simple things, we can build in our mind more complex stuff. And I might have thoughts in the coming week where I can explain this better. But this idea of simplicity is something where, as we think about it, it'll help us also, like thinking about it in light of this distinction between our brain and our mind that we're talking about. It'll help us understand the nature of simplicity. And by thinking of the nature of simplicity, it'll help us to understand the distinction. So back and forth in that way, which also means that as we start, both will be a little fuzzy. But as we continue, they'll both clear each other out better. So that's what I'm talking about. But that's why as I start, it's not necessarily that obvious. The law of attraction is actually a pretty good simplifier. The idea, now it's in one sense an oversimplification, but then there's a way we can hone it that's really not an oversimplification, that's very useful. I've touched on the topic in the past. I feel like I had something a little bit of an extra angle on it here. I'm not sure if I'll be able to communicate it in this webinar. I'll take a stab at it. I use it to great effect as I was building OMG. There's a simplification that I use constantly. Simplification, it's not exactly the right word. It comes down to the fundamental idea of law of implication, which is you focus on what you can know and you keep building from there. You want to have these things that you realize are correct, that are like beacons for you, that you don't violate, and you understand them in a way where like life becomes, it creates all these simple boundaries in a good way for your mind to operate from. But if we wanted to have a good quality of member, right, for example, then however we really operate, that's going to affect it. An example of a simple thing. I thought of that might be a little bit vague though. Should I just had another example in my head? It's similar, but not the example I had, but also something I haven't quite pointed out necessarily about the no refund policy is that, or I might have, but I don't remember doing so, is when and there's times to offer refund. But when you do offer refunds for an information product, then there's a way it lets you as the guru, whatever, the information product business, it lets you off the hook in a certain way. And this type of thing is something to look out for, not just with this example of refunds, but I'll give a different type of example of it in a moment too, that I have on another slide. Let's say you give a 30-day, let's do 60-day refund period. At the end of those 60 days, there's a way that you breathe a sigh of relief in a sense and feel like, okay, they had their chance to refund and they didn't. So I've done my job. And it's a real phenomenon. Like I can feel it myself if there's refunds available. Then there's a way that you check out a little bit, right? Just realistically, because it's a vector. You might not check out, but the vector's there. Whoops. If that makes sense. Like a vector does not dictate a result, right? Like a force in a certain direction, but it's still a current. It's still there. And so if there's a way that it de-incentivizes you. If people bought in the first place with no refund and for a 12-month program, let's say, if there's a 2-month period, then there's no refunds, then for the next 10 months, there's a way you can check out a little bit. Of course, you still do your job and so forth, but you feel like, all right, well, they had their chance and they didn't take it, right? And so they've approved of it. But if people signed on in the first place with no refunds, and there's no period in which you can check out, a little bit like with marriage, where sometimes people check out, right? They feel like, all right, I've married the person or I've done this for the person or whatever. And then they put in like less effort. So this is it's an example of a certain type of simplification where partially struggling to make all this relate in a clear way, but by refusing to gratuitously or without a very good reason and I don't know if it's even without a very good reason, but to have vectors against what I'm trying to do. Oh, I know what it is. Unless there's just an emergency of some sort, then I just don't do things where it's going to set a vector against what I'm trying to accomplish. And that's one of my kind of shortcut, the useful shortcut of cause and effect. Another that I've talked about is when you're going to sell something, the idea of it's like a shortcut. There's so much complexity when it comes to all the different nuances of trying to make a sale, all the different things you could pay attention to, both with what you say, with how you listen, and even their physical reaction to their stuff. But really making sure that you want to buy what you're selling rather than sell what you're selling is a kind of a big shortcut that simplifies things. And there's a way that I embrace this certain type of true shortcuts because of this distinction of you and your mind. You can build complexity by building one simple thing and the next simple thing and the next simple thing until you have a lot of stuff built over time, meaning that you can focus on one thing and get it right with a sales presentation or with networking and then get the next thing. But I'm working on consciously, that's when I try to keep it simple. And by doing that, and if you want complexity, it's not like you want complexity, but if you want something big, you want a lot of parts to work, which you need sometimes, right? If you wanted a car that was very good, then the way I would go about it is I would go one part at a time and get it right. And eventually you would end up with a car that was complex, that all the parts work. But there's ways that illustrates what I'm saying, but there's ways it doesn't. But it's not just the one thing. I'm not just saying do one thing at a time, though. We can try to imagine, by the opposite, we could try to imagine a person who's trying to put together an event or do a car, make a great car, and they're trying to make everything work really well at once. I can imagine them saying, look, everything has to be perfect. We need great attention to detail. We need to do this right, and we need to do that right. We need to do this right. Instead of approaching it that way, where I have to get everything right to begin with, and where there's this kind of inherent complexity that I'm trying to make it all work. And there's a way that people do that, like commonly. I try to find like the most important thing, which means I have to get a sense of how to know what's important. And then you figure out what's important, which again relates to bottlenecks, right? What do we have to get right first? That's going to really help. And if there's a few candidates, you can't tell the difference. You let your mind pick one. It's fine, right? You don't fight the battle. If there's 3 things that look very important, as long as you carry through the scenario a bit, but if you do what you do consciously right, and they all still look the same or similar, then just go with what you would pick one. right? And go there. Just if you have 3 tasks you need to do for your business and you think them through and you need to do them all and they're all important, then you still pick one and focus on it. And there's a way that people will feel overwhelmed in a lot of cases and they'll think they have to do them all well at once. Even if a sales presentation, even if I knew I wouldn't make the sale unless I got 3 different things right, I still would only focus on doing one thing right until I can get it right. And if that meant I had to lose sales, that's one thing. I would, of course, try to get those things right in a way to practice out before I went to actually burn out a lead if I could. But if the only thing I could do was burn out leads in order to get it right, that's okay. No problem. Because you can't do what you need to do consciously if you have to get consciously involved. And how do you tell? If your mind can just do it itself, you can even see. You can just try to do something natural, like as your mind normally does, right? Just try to do something. Just try to accomplish something. And if you don't accomplish it, then that means by default, your mind might not be able to do it. Now, there's the question of the environment. And this is all getting into, this is nice. This is getting into quite a practical formula that you can apply here. So let's play this out. This is coming together nicely. Take anything, a business, dating, whatever. You try to do it, or just selling to clients, right? Getting clients, the first, getting potential clients, networking, getting traffic, right? First, you just try to go do it. So you try to go do it and then it'll work to whatever degree it works. Remember, we're getting to know red flags are getting stuck anyway, right? If there's bad stuff coming up, so either you're not getting the result you want and it's not either. So the red flags would be you're not getting the result that you want, which isn't the same as bad. That's important, but you're not getting the result you want, or there's something bad on the presumed way to getting the result, or you get the result, but there's still some bad. So either bad is a red flag, like feeling bad, maladaptive, obviously maladaptive responses or actions and stuff, that's all wrapped up in bad. And then, or you're not getting the result that you're hoping to get. Once that happens, you might repeat once or twice just to get a sense of the environment, right? Obviously, if you're dating is an easy example, or if you're trying to rank a website, if you try to rank, you might want to start with a few websites, right? And see how it works out. Not every keyword is going to work right away or something. If you're trying to date, just because the first person doesn't become your soulmate, it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. But if you're running into trouble, if you thought someone had good potential and yet things didn't work out and you wanted them to, right? If you feel bad or you think you could have gotten a better result, whatever it might be. Now you're deciding, okay, I'm going to get consciously involved. And I think that way, right? I'm like, all right, this is a bottleneck. This is an issue. I want this result. I'm not getting it. I need to get involved consciously. When you're getting involved consciously, that's when you need to split things up so there's simplicity at each step of the way. It can all add up to something that when you step back and look at what it added up to, it's complex, but it's built properly. But you built something that's solid and well built, even though it's complex. You built it well by building each piece carefully, properly. If any of the pieces can already get built very well by your existing self, then you don't need to be involved consciously, right? By logic. But any result in life that that's not happening automatically or simply by your brain doing it, you need to get involved consciously. When you do that, then you need to understand what facilitates consciously involved success. And that's going to, again, involve clarity, simplicity, scenarios, right? You can think about those dates that didn't work out and what you said or the follow up to them. Or you can continue to go on dates, but you're paying attention in a certain way where now you're consciously involved. You're not trying to get the result. Of course, you're automatically trying to get the result in one sense, your mind is, right? But you consciously are now trying to understand things. Where's the bottleneck? You're looking for the bottleneck. You're looking for the most important bottleneck at first. If you see multiple ones, okay. You pick one or one's more important. You'll get to the other ones later, right? You do one at a time. So one thing at a time consciously is critical and creatively. And your brain is involved with everything you do consciously. Your mind is also involved. So don't get confused by that. But what you're trying to do is realize or take notice or bring to mind, bring to notice distinctions where things don't match, they don't add up. And as you do that consciously, your mind will get it too. Like when you get the right clarity, your mind will say, oh, that doesn't match. And that's how you know your mind did get it, is it'll give you a feeling. Oh yeah, I see that now. It does not match. When you have that feeling, that's a new distinction, right? Literally a distinction is something that doesn't match the other thing, right? That's why it's distinct, but it's like a line in between one thing and the other. So that's what's happened is you have intentionally brought about a new distinction. And that's what your brain needs you to do. And then it can do the rest. I don't necessarily think that's full click closure on this topic, but it is progress. And we can talk to each other a little bit. I'll take a break for a minute and I'll come right back. I see Joe has potentially a good question here. Joe, if there's anything further you want to add to this, right? I know maybe you posted some other stuff down here, but if you want to add anything to your post based on the last hour, that's fine. You don't need to, but I'll address that first in a minute when I come back. I'll be right back. Okay. And I don't think that, again, we have like perfect clarity yet, or even like that was the most efficient possible potential way to explain things. But this is embracing that is part of the success process. Like we have to be able to talk and work through understanding this and be comfortable with, there's a certain way this webinar exemplifies the success process. Like those of you who are willing to stick with this, to not necessarily understand everything, I'm willing to talk about this topic without necessarily having all my examples perfectly pat. If I had them already, I would give them to you, of course, and I work on it. I worked on this plenty for decades and then even this week and today. But we just keep making progress. We see this thing, that thing, we add a building block here, a building block there. And as we do that, it'll come together. And this distinction is absolutely necessary. This isn't like optional in life. This isn't like it's my thing or whatever. It's just needs to be distinguished. And you're totally locked out of so much until, and the extent to which you get this is just going to help so much. Okay. So Joe says, David, I'm still not seeing how the consciousness field is distinct from the brain. Doesn't the brain create the consciousness field? Because you get hit on the head and knocked out, you don't experience anything. It's like the consciousness field is turned off. Okay. Couple things. And just to, again, looking at some opposites here. If you unplug a computer, then the screen will shut off. But that doesn't mean that the plug creates what's on the screen, right? There's a kind of in that case, there's maybe a chain or a cascade or whatever. Similarly, you can have a group of people and you need all four of them, let's say, to do a project. But that doesn't mean that because let's say you absolutely need one of them, each of them, but any particular one, you absolutely need them. But it doesn't mean that they're doing it just because you need them. Or because the other three people do stuff and maybe other stuff gets done as well. And there's building blocks they buy for the people and so forth. The brain does not create the consciousness field. God creates the consciousness field. And that isn't a religious point of view. That's not even a point of view or a belief. It's actually the logical confusion would be if you have a previous definition of God and you double define the word God. I'm actually defining God as, first we understand that something has to create your consciousness field. That something obviously has to be capable of creating a consciousness field. And something capable of creating a consciousness field needs to have various qualities. And it turns out that we can come to qualities even like being all powerful when it comes to making consciousness fields. I've got to the proof of that before, where if the power of all the things that can create consciousness fields is limited, then by what? Limited means limited by something. Anyway, it's by looking at the idea of being limited. So you need to have an entity of power that's unlimited in a certain way. People can confuse what unlimited means. Illogical is not the same as unlimited. God can't make a stone that's too big for God to lift because that phrase is a nonsense phrase. It's not a thing. It's just, again, it's an inherently contradictory phrase. So God can't make an inherently contradictory thing non-contradictory. Of course, by rephrasing it, but so my constructed definition of God is the entity that's creating your conscious field or my conscious field. And then we can figure out further qualities that God might have. And that's my only definition and meaning of the word God. And so again, it's not religious. It's how we want it, logical, correct, etc. And you have a conscious field for something has to be making it. Or we could say maybe nothing makes it. But then now we're back to the idea of things happening for or your conscious field existing for no reason, which leads to nonsense in every way. And you can't live your life based on that for a second. Because you'd have to imagine that everything happens for no reason. You need to never blame anyone for anything. You need to not act as if any of your actions or thoughts had any consequence whatsoever. Because consequence means that things happen in a sequence based on what happened before, which in and of itself is a reason. Reason is something that an entity that could create your conscious field that would have to have a reason why it's one way rather than another. The reason doesn't create the conscious field either. There needs to be something that can create a conscious field. The reason is a reason why the entity creating what created the way it is rather than something. So the brain doesn't make your conscious field. What your brain is part of the reason why your conscious field is the way it is. Your brain is super important to what ends up in your conscious field. And because other people obviously have brains too, it's super important in interacting with other people. So understanding the brain is obviously hugely important for life. It's not like a specialized topic that some people should do and some people shouldn't do. We all need to understand how the mind works, at least in a way that's practical, like for our lives, like for doing business, for having relationships. It's not the same thing as like becoming a psychiatrist or even understanding the biochemistry. I'm not saying that. We don't need to necessarily do that. But the type of stuff I talk about, the mind, it's necessary for all of us because it's so practical. It's so involved. It's important, literally, my constructed definition of important means related to impact. Something that's important has more impact than something else. If something's more important than something else on the quality of your life, your experience, the quality of your results, etc. Obviously, your mind has a tremendous impact on your life, huge impact. And then understanding it obviously as well has a huge impact on your ability to cause good effects and so, or to do whatever you do that leads to good things being caused by God. Robbie said, it helped me to understand this by running through the scenario that I don't uphold my conscious field directly because otherwise that would just make it awesome. Excellent. That's right, Robbie. And then that's a great example of showing the opposite. Obviously, you don't create your conscious field. Now, Joe's also talking about your brain doing it. I'll go over both. So you're obviously not creating your conscious field. You'd have to be aware of every part of your conscious field before you made it in order to make it. Right? You have to, which would be impossible. And you're not doing it. Plus, you'd, of course, make it just awesome, right? Why doesn't God make it just awesome? It's part of the whole free will thing and us having the capacity to have our own free will in order to love other people. If we exercise our free will properly, then everyone's conscious field will be. And we'll have the benefit of benefiting from loving and caring about other people and having them be better. Your brain does not just directly make, how do we know that your brain isn't making your conscious field? Once again, your brain would have to be aware of your consciousness field. The brain would have to basically have all the qualities of God in order to make your conscious field. It would have to be able to make conscious fields in the first place, which means you would need to be aware of what it was making before it made it, right? Which means your brain would have to be aware. Like, again, your brain would literally have to be God, have to end up being all powerful and so forth. You could say, well, what would have to be all powerful? Couldn't it just make your own conscious field, not other people's? You're just going into the gray area. The way you resolve stuff, you're just trying to answer something directly without being willing to do the steps. If someone asks that kind of question, if you do the steps of understanding what it means to be limited and so forth, figuring out the nature of God piece by piece, then you will come to the conclusion that you're trying to get to, but you can't do it in one fell swoop. Like any result that you're trying to get that you don't already have, the only way or the most efficient way to get it is to be willing to do what it takes to get there. In this case, understanding the stuff means wading through the stuff with me and then with yourself, with doing scenarios and thinking things through, thinking about what can I know that isn't right or that doesn't add up. And for me, it's the same thing. I have to be willing to get on a webinar and talk about this stuff without necessarily having the perfect way to explain it already figured out. Right. And that's how I'll get there. Very nice. I appreciate that, Henry. Glad to be here. Glad you're all here now. Joe says, David, when you say consciously involved, What does that look like? Yeah, I agree. One of the things I got to in this webinar that I want to develop, and I'll probably look to develop it like in the future, like next webinar and so forth, see how things come together this week. But I want this to be very practical for you, of course. The whole point of all this is for it to be practical. And the only reason I think about these things is because they're important, which literally, as I said, means impact, which means they're practical. They're a practical impact and important. Sometimes in order to get there, of course, we need to, just like with SEO, right? It's one of the most efficient ways to make money for somebody that doesn't otherwise have a massively efficient way that there is. But there's a process to it, right? You have to learn a bunch of things that if you weren't doing SEO, you wouldn't have to learn, right? And you're not immediately going to make money while you're learning those things. But then it's of immense practical importance, even if it's not of an incredibly, and it's a quite immediate in the sense of can happen within 3 to 6 months or even faster compared to many other methods that take years and years. However, it's still not instantaneous, like fully instantaneous, just like this. But I'll continue to make this very practical, like this distinction about you and your brain. It's super practical and applicable to all the things that you're currently working on. I just need to perhaps help you with that. And perhaps you're already there. Perhaps I was even help you more than I even think already. Do think that help you overall. But I don't know how much closure at least we got to on this web, but we'll see. David, when you say consciously involved, this is something Joe's asking. What does that look like? Does that imply that you are doing something? I thought the conscious being didn't do anything. No. The conscious being, you must do, I've said this in the past, it must do like one thing that it's like a light that could turn on or off. The reason I figured that out, that it has to be that, is because if you could do multiple things, you need a way to decide. Now you're down to processing. If you could do 3 things, you'd have to figure out which of those 3 things to do, which again is something our brain does that takes like information processing. Whatever you do needs to not take information processing. It needs to, which now if you did nothing whatsoever, nothing would have a point. There'd be no reason for anything. And there'd be no reason for God to have made any things that would result in bad right now. The reason we have things result in bad, it relates to free will, which relates to the capacity to love, which relates to abundance, which is more than if God just put us in a permanent state of non-free will bliss. It needs to be the case that you can do something, but whatever that something is, it has to be simple. And that something, it's hard to describe with people's normal representation or model of the world. But one way to point to it is to say, to seek to understand what's true, good, and important. And everything I do is talking about or indicating or giving more so you can have a model where you can notice or understand or have a distinction about what it is that you do. Another way to put it is that when there's a red flag of any kind of bad or basically, or when there can maybe be more good and you're not getting to it, when there's a red flag and even if your mind makes you feel totally certain about something, you need to be able to say, wait a second, I don't know yet that matches. If you do know it matches, that's one thing. If it's very simple and clear, 2 dots here, 2 dots there, you can tell it matches. Great. But there's all sorts of stuff where your mind tells you things match. And the fundamental lie, the fundamental matching that your mind makes you feel like adds up is, I know such and such. Remember, I pointed out to you that you're constantly saying stuff that could be structured in syntax. It is true that, right? It is true that my parents are such and such. It is true that I like this person. It is true that I'm smart or whatever. If someone says I'm smart or I'm good at this or whatever, I'm not saying those things are false. I'm just saying that whenever you basically make an assertion, the words "it is true that" can be put in front of that, like syntactically or logically or whatever. So you're constantly making these statements, and if that's correct, you're given that correct, that you're constantly making statements that are equivalent to "it is true that." Truth always involves matching. So if you say I'm smart or I think I'm a good person, then you're saying it is true that I think, or so you're saying I'm a good enough person, I'm a good person. Then you're saying it is true that I'm a good person, which means you're making an assertion of matching, that something has to match something else. But your mind is constantly giving you these conclusions that you might feel certain of, but you can't even identify what's supposed to match what. What's matching what? If you're a good person, I guess your thoughts and actions are matching up with standards. But are you clearly aware of what the exact standards are for what makes a good person? And then what's a good person? Yourself, your brain, your body, your mind, your actions. What performs actions? your mind, brain, and body. Yourself is what's performing it. So the only thing that could be good if you're matching up with standards is the previous actions or your body, yourself, not even you as a conscious being. If we're talking about actions, right, measuring up to a standard, instead of thinking in terms, therefore, so that very thought, I'm a good person, it ends up falling apart in all kinds of ways. It's not even like it's an inherently nonsensical statement, right? It's misidentifying who you are. It's asserting that you're aware of a standard of exactly what good is. Have to be precise, right? The standard, and that you have to be precise, and in some way your mind would have to be clear on it. But if it's not absolutely clear on what it means to be a good person, exactly, or at least the threshold, then how could it say something matches it or something's over the threshold unless there's clarity? But people generally don't. They just assume away all sorts of stuff about that thing, or they're smart. What's exactly the standard for being smart? If you don't know the exact standard or your brain doesn't, then how could it know that something matches? And yet people are constantly saying stuff like that or thinking stuff like that, or at least trying to measure up. But people are constantly, again, making these statements of truth must mean a statement that one thing matches another. But how could you consciously agree that two things match if you aren't consciously clear on whether they match? And generally that would be too much information for you to even be aware of at one time. So you'd have to see how the opposite of whatever's supposed to be true has to not match or has to not be true. Like Perseus there. And remember, if you want examples of the opposite thing, just listen to everything I say. I'm giving an example every moment by demonstrating how the opposite. Joanne asks, perhaps this question has been asked already, but here it is anyways. How do I know something isn't true, but my brain believes it is true? And she might be gone again, but either way I can answer it for the recording, and I'm sure it's a good question. She says, how do I know something isn't true, but my brain believes it is true? Okay. What she's saying is, so there's this idea, let's take the idea of the quarantine that we talked about before. So she figured out, like intellectually or whatever, that something isn't the case, but she still feels like it's the case. For example, we might think it isn't true that I want to eat cake, but then you look at the cake and you want it, or maybe having a dinner with someone and then you don't think it'll be good for you, but you want it anyway, right? But there's an explanation for that. And that is that what you feel is based on your brain's wiring in essence. Right. Okay. What you feel is based on your brain's wiring. And you really want to have a representation of it, like a mental representation of this. When you can feel what I'm saying here, it can really open up some doors. Your feelings of what's true comes from basically neurons being wired up. And it doesn't matter if that's literal or figurative. It still amounts to meaning that if you have a mind that lives on past your brain dying or in addition to your brain, then the equivalent of that, of neurons, might not have actual neurons. So your feelings come from basically neurons being attached to each other and firing off. We need to not be trapped by that, but our feelings are really, they're a symptom of what your brain doesn't feel, but it does the thing that creates the symptom of you feeling, right? So in other words, if you feel like something is correct, then there's an underlying processing that your brain is operating on the idea that it's correct. It has that association, right? The feeling is an indication of the wiring. So the wiring is there. Wiring doesn't necessarily change instantly when you figure something out properly. Sometimes it does. When it does, it tends to be because a category got switched. Your brain can apparently switch categories very quickly when it notices the right thing, but not other types of associations don't change right away. So again, a feeling tells you what your brain has wired up currently. That's different than something you just kind of figured out. Figuring something out, having a thought, this relates to learning as well. When you learn something in the moment, like when you listen to this webinar and right now, right, you're hearing the webinar, whatever you're learning from the webinar, it isn't really hard coded into your mind, into your brain. It's more in a state of flux, soft coded, or it's like electrical impulses rather than connections. And when you sleep, and again, the science on this is fairly accurate, but if it's not perfectly accurate, but the gist of it is pretty much probably almost certainly correct. When you sleep, then this kind of soft coding and these electrical impulses get turned into more permanent connections. Anyway, over time, so that's the learning part of it. Over time, what you act on and also what scenarios you play out in your mind, both playing out a scenario in your mind and taking action, both affect the neuronal wiring of your brain. Studies have shown that, right? In either way. And plus, you can just experience it. Obviously, if you think something through vividly in your mind, like a scenario, as if it was real, then it has some impact on your neuron connections. And either quickly or slowly, those connections will change. And being aware of that whole process is critical because it also lets you put your feelings in the right context. Your feelings are worth trusting when it's in the gray area. Don't interfere with your mind. It's not efficient. It's not helpful. But you can help your mind whenever you help it have clarity about something that you can tell is correct, which might narrow down the gray. It tends to be much more realistic and actually correct. And it's a shortcut that'll help you. If you want to help your mind pick the right thing, pick the right person to network with, just to have a simple illustration that's easy to see, then look to narrow down the options with what you can know rather than to go after picking necessarily. You don't try to pick the right, figure out, help your brain pick the exact right person. You instead, and it might not be that you narrow down actual people. You might just help yourself notice certain things that'll help it narrow things down. Wait, let me think about what's the result that I'm going for and get that clear in your mind. Might be phone numbers, might be just people that recognize you the next time you come, might be more efficient than even getting a phone number. Get a phone number, it might be too pushy. It might actually take you backwards. It might not, but it might. So having your ideals or your stepping stones, your semi-soft blocks, clear in your mind by running through the scenario in your mind will give your mind often more clarity than it had previously. That might not cross off an actual person that you might network with out of 20, but it gives more clarity and then your brain will pick better by itself. That's the kind of thing you want to do. The more and more you embrace this idea of shading off parts of the gray properly, instead of pushing with your brain to guess the right one in the gray and then convince yourself that you picked right. That's what I mean by doubling down on what your brain already does, and it's counterproductive. Robbie says, I recently thought through a reasonable plan to get to 100 million within 5 years. Excellent. Involving information products, SEO, client consulting, which I may or may not go for once I get to a stable base of 3 million. Cool. Okay, I'm very glad to hear that. Oh, see more. Okay, let me see here. No? Okay. Love it. And I like that. Reasonable plan. That's a great word to put with that. And best wishes with that. And hopefully you'll get there. I was going to say, hopefully I'll help you, but hopefully you'll get there. If I help you or not, that's not really relevant. Given that if we stipulate that you get there, then it doesn't matter whether we help. But I'm glad within the way that I'm glad to do. Kevin says, not sure if this is a silly question. This part of the Crushing series and I'm brain dead for OG. Liz posted the question yesterday of what is your goal you would like to reach in 6 months? But notice what I just said before, that can help you get clarity, right? By running through the scenario, but especially if you do it right. It's doubling down. I'll read the rest of the question, but if you just are having your brain reinforce its own feelings about what it wants, that might not give clarity. If you are trying to bring to light what your mind's, not your mind of not feelings, but what the precursor to your mind's feelings are, what your mind is already processing is the goal. That's helpful. Now you're bringing it to the light of the day that you can examine it. Will that goal be a helpful stepping stone and a useful semi-soft block, a useful thing to go for that if you're competent? A semi-soft block means a goal that reveals itself that'll help you on your way to your ideal in a way that it's realistic to get to if you really focus. And if you get to it, then if you're competent from then on out, you'll hit your ideal. So you can lead your mind to think, what is the current goal that it's going after? What is it currently conclude is what is appealing? And then you can examine it. Can that be honed in any way, or is it totally reasonable? By doing that process, it can give your mind itself more clarity on the goal, which can help keep it focused on that goal. And furthermore, you can help, as I said, to hone it if necessary. So those are a couple useful things about that. I know from earlier LOI videos, you don't want to set yourself up for failure by feeling bad if you don't hit a target by a certain date. Certainly. All you do then is say, all right, that's an ideal, both the 6 month, or it's a reasonable guess of an ideal, both the 6 months and what's supposed to happen in the 6 months. And if I hit the ideal, then that's what I'll do. Here's what I'll do next. And if I don't hit the ideal, here's what I'll do. As soon as you do that, you're not setting yourself up for failure. Just don't do the pattern or the formula. My plan, plan A, my plan is for plan A to work. Just don't do that. Your plan is that if you hit plan A, then okay, generally what will you do next? All right. And what you'll do next will not be anything huge, but just, okay, good. Like I'll have a building block. It's clear. Right. And on the way to an ideal. And then the other part of the plan would be if I don't hit plan A, the target or the 6 months or both, then what will I do? And it generally it follows a similar pattern, right? And so it'll become habit that you can have ideals reveal themselves. You don't have to set the goal. You can reveal what would be a reasonable time frame to imagine hitting a certain target. It reveals itself not as necessarily truth that's certain, but as a reasonable guess. And then what you'll also have a habit of doing at some point is to know what you'll do if you don't, which will be pretty simple, right? You'll assess at that point of whether you want to continue in the same direction a little longer, or whether there's something that you want to notice that you're doing that's inefficient, or you'll certainly look and see what's the bottleneck at that point and address that, or seek to address it. Or if you don't know what the bottleneck is, then you'll, of course, try to do things to see what the bottleneck is. You'll poke around, try different things and to reveal the bottleneck. That's an example of simplicity, right? These patterns that I'm giving you will repeat themselves in everything you're doing, or a lot of what you're doing, right? It's not true that you should feel bad, that you don't just have a plan for planning to succeed, that you're looking for bottlenecks. These are all heuristics or things that'll come up a lot. And these give you building blocks to have that are simple and clear and correct. Then Kevin went on to write, but if I was still waiting to aim for my goal target idea, so we soft locked by 6 months, especially after this weekend, I feel like it's more possible. Good. Now, let me address that. That's something I wanted to mention. What is it about a positive attitude that's helpful? What is it about believing you could do something that's helpful? I've alluded to this in the past, but clearly, if your mind doesn't believe that something is possible or likely or whatever, then it's not going to allocate resources to that. And it's going to make you feel motivated somewhere else. It's going to try to get you a different path, right? So the useful part of a positive attitude is simply the belief, which a belief is what you think and act upon, that what you're doing, what you're putting resources, or what you're potentially going to put resources into, is worthwhile. Now, you don't want to believe that about something that's not worthwhile. But if it is worthwhile, you want to believe that. You want to act upon it and think it, which also means you want to associate it up in your brain. Right. So again, a positive attitude boils down to something that's necessarily correct. So it can have multiple meanings, some of which are helpful, some of which are not, some of which are correct, some of which aren't. But there's a correct and clear idea that you do want, which is that if something is worthwhile, then obviously you want to believe that it is. A person who has a positive attitude towards learning is somebody that believes that acts upon and thinks based upon the idea that learning is worthwhile, which means the person will allocate resources into learning. Given that learning in plenty of circumstances is worthwhile, it pays to have a positive attitude about it. If a person does not have a positive attitude about learning, either in a specific topic or in general, then the person won't allocate resources. Sometimes in life, certain objectives are not worthwhile. In those cases, you obviously do not want to think that they're worthwhile. That might look like a negative attitude to people who would like to believe that it's worthwhile, but it's not a negative attitude in a maladaptive or unhelpful way if you're simply correct that a certain allocation of resources is not worthwhile. once a person is in a strategic or has a framework, the correct framework, I was going to say mindset, but it's really whenever we're talking about mindset, we can talk about framework. But if someone has the right understanding of a framework for strategy, which means that they are consistently incorporating the idea of resource management, then they don't fall into the same trap about negative thinking. If you have to allocate resources, then obviously you have to take a hard look at what's important. And when you're looking at what's important, you need to have the idea that some things are less important, at least currently, or in this within these parameters, right? You have what you're going after or what's going on. And of course, it's not a negative in that circuit, in that context. So I wanted to point that out. So when you say you feel like it's more possible, then assuming it is, then you do want to have a positive attitude, which means, in my constructed definition here, that you act upon the idea that it's worthwhile, which means your mind will help you allocate resources to it, which means you'll feel more motivated, less distracted, and so forth. As long as that is what you want to allocate resources to, ideally, then you're much better off believing in it and believing in its importance, and so, including believing it's possible in the first place. Clearly, if you don't believe something's possible, then you don't believe it's important and in a sense of allocating resources to. It might be important if it were possible, but given that it's impossible, it's not important in the sense of wanting to allocate resources. So you see how all of this works together. All of this fundamentally makes sense as a framework. There might be parts of this framework I'm giving you that aren't clear yet. Today we addressed and are continuing to address one of the harder concepts for people to get because people don't have the framework and they have such a complex or well-developed framework. The opposite of what I'm talking about, or the opposite of that we're different than our brain, right? So we're having to deconstruct it and build a new one while living and talking within the framework that we have. So we're having to get from where we're at together, where we start, get over to someplace new. And it's a different framework, but we have to step every step of the way. And yet the framework has to be torn down. So we're operating within our old framework while trying to tear it down, while having to talk to some degree with it. And that's why it can feel tough sometimes. Any advice about going about that on a day-to-day basis in terms of aiming for the 6-month goal? Great. So Kevin said, thank you. I probably already gave a sense of it. But if it is what you want, you constantly want to have what I'm saying is, I've said it before, but it's very, very important. You want to have one and only one priority within parameters. Any one time, any one situation, right? There's times when you want to have your significant other, if you have one, wife, whatever, be a priority within certain parameters. If there's no parameters where your husband or wife or whatever is a priority, that's going to cause a problem. You also want business or making money in general to be a priority within certain parameters. One of those parameters might mean you don't have enough money yet. Others might be that it's the appropriate time and the place to be working on it and so forth. Furthermore, when you are working on making money, then whatever you want to have parameters active in which there's one priority that you have at any one time. There could be triggers where something else becomes a priority. So it doesn't mean that from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. automatically only one thing regarding work is a priority, because you might get a phone call correctly or usefully triggers a different thing being a priority because that's a parameter. Somebody calls you, the parameters changed. Yeah, the parameters shifted, so you're operating within different parameters, and then could be a different priority within those parameters. But there should always be you should always have a set of the parameters and the priority. And there should be exactly one priority. There could be a bit of a cascade of priorities if you've already allocated all possible resources to one priority. But that can, as soon as I say that, that's like a new parameter, right? You can no longer work on a particular priority or usefully direct resources to it. But that fact becomes a parameter that makes a new thing. So in a way of understanding it, there's always exactly one priority. And it's terrific to have more awareness of it, including that means your brain having its version of awareness, right? Your brain isn't consciously aware, but it has an equivalent to awareness, right? Where it's associated up in a way. We can understand there's just facts and things that you don't know in the sense of your brain has never done its version of experience. It hasn't been exposed to. there's factors, facts, or input that your brain is not taking into account at any one moment. It's not part of the processing. That means, and that's like your brain's version of awareness, right? If something isn't part of the inputs that's leading to the outputs, that your brain's not its version of awareness. So you want one of the input that your brain is using at any one time is the priority, including and the parameters. Literally, that should be part of what your brain's processing at all times. Doesn't mean you're all wrong if it's not the case, but it's just an idea. Like, you're not wrong for not having hit an ideal, right? But that is something that is fairly achievable in the sense that I generally, if you stop me and said, what are your parameters right now and what are your priorities, I could pretty much tell you, I believe, for a second. I'm not consciously aware of it at all moments, but it's part of my brain's processing consistently, which happens by habit, right? You can have your brain have certain things as part of the processing, just like the fact that you're married and who you're married to can be part of your processing pretty consistently in life, right? You don't have to be consciously aware that you're married and who you're married to at all times for it to be kind of part of what's being taken into account in the background by your brain. It's one of the inputs in its process. But that's kind of what I mean. But it'll probably take some conscious doing to get that to be the case with your brain. I think by default, people's brains don't have that as part of their inputs of fairly clear priority and what the parameters are, that boundary, why that's a priority right now and not something else, and what the triggers are for a new thing to become a priority and so forth. If I'm working on a project for business, then what that might look like is there's parameters in my life for when I'm going to work on business. That might be when certain people call me. It might be when certain people call me within certain hours if I'm not doing something else. Again, the parameters might look like, just by way of example, I'm not suggesting this for one way or the other. It just depends on your life and your circumstances. But just to give you, instead of just talking vaguely about parameters, let me just give you some specifics, potential specifics, by way of illustration. So from 10:30 to 11:30, I might watch a TV show with my wife. From 2:30 to 4 o'clock p.m., I might take a nap with my wife. My son might have quiet time. If somebody calls me during those times, I might not even hear it. If someone calls me at another time, that's not one of those two times, and if I'm awake, the parameter, then I might answer, then I'll answer, and for business, and something that they're working on might be a priority unless I'm currently in the middle of something that, upon hearing what they're wanting me to attend to and given what I'm currently working on, I might decide at that moment which would have more impact or which is more important to address. Generally, it would be what the person's calling me about, unless if I have a webinar like now, then unless there was something of greater importance than showing up on the webinar, which would be rare, it would have to be some kind of significant emergency and timely. But you see how all parameters that are taken into account, and it's how I think, how my brain thinks at this point, and really by habit, without me having to consciously interfere always. I'm not constantly checking over, wait, what are my parameters? What are my priorities currently? And I don't know that I really even tried to have that be a habit. I just came to understand, I guess, my whole model. Oh, I think the way it got built was my model kind of contextually led to this being obviously the way to operate, like to my brain. I didn't have to like try to make the habit. It just grew out of the rest of my model for how life and strategy and importance and all this stuff work. I think that's how it happened for me. Right. So there's parameters on when I might work. There's triggers on what might trigger I'm working rather than not. I have certain tasks I might need to do, then I do them. Then I still might not be spending time with my family or my wife or whoever, my son, and I might not be working because there's no tasks for me to do. But if the phone rings, then I might work. Right. Those are all examples of parameters, priorities. So it might be that simple. If I'm working on a project, then I might be attending to a certain bottleneck. And if someone calls me on something that's not a bottleneck and I'm still working on something that is, then I might just do something that's simple with that person, not put much focus into it, have them do whatever they would do by default. For example, if they're bottlenecked in a way that matters, then and that takes my attention, I still might not attend to it if there's a more important bottleneck, or I might, depending on again where the impact seems to matter. But it all has to do with bottlenecks importance, which has to do with impact, and then parameters, triggers, things like that. And I don't build in arbitrary and restrictive parameters that don't help and just restrict my flexibility. Okay, from 5 to 6, I'm going to do such and such, unless I needed that in order to help my mind stay focused. But that would be because I was addressing an important bottleneck in the first place, right? And I was making the 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. thing to get my mind focused to help me work, because that was addressing a further bottleneck if it was for some reason difficult for me to work. But I don't really run into that. I don't personally. Other people might, and it's just not one of my personal issues. If something needs to be done, then I don't need to really schedule to do it. I just feel motivated to do it because it's addressing a bottleneck that I'm clear on for myself. That might further illustrate. Megan Lee writes, to experiment with goals and motivation. This week, when I'm thinking what to do next, I begin by saying, my brain will most likely not show me what is most important. And that might be the case right now. Great. And so it helps you because it makes it easier to not get caught up. There's times when your intuition, it's reasonable to suppose that it's on, right, with other things in your life. And with this, you've noticed that your intuition isn't so great. And I've noticed that with myself, with certain topics, my intuition isn't very on target. With other things, it isn't more on target. And of course, what you want to do is judge that accurately. What I think you're doing. I mean, you're doing it because you think that you screwed up or whatever in this case, but presumably you wouldn't be motivated otherwise to think that. Anyway, regardless, what you want to do is, of course, determine where your default is likely to work out well and where it isn't, rather than blow smoke up your own ass, right? Rather than just have that goal of believe that you're already competent. And so in that way, of course, you can understand that like competence comes from heuristics, right? And you develop more heuristics in that. You can have the ideal to be competent rather than the goal to already be competent, as usual. Okay. And then Megan went on to write, and then I ask questions that run impact scenarios for various possibilities to do or not do. That's excellent. That's exactly right. I also ask, what am I missing, to be open for any other important possibility. It's been a common, productive week building things that stack. Thanks, David. Yeah, excellent. Those are just great heuristics all around. So I love it. And if you keep running those heuristics, you might get to where your intuition of what's important starts to match up quite well with what is important. And then it all becomes easy, right? Because you have that quarantined area like I talked about where you have things correct. That'll influence default. And then your life becomes easier and easier as the default thinking of your mind matches up with what's actually correct and adaptive and productive. Great. And Brian seconds this motion. Scenarios, I don't understand them. Joanny writes, what are they? Can you give me examples? Yeah, it's super duper helpful to get. That's a great question because it's a topic where as you get it, have a good impact. My go-to example of the scenario is if you're about to go on vacation and you're thinking of what to bring, then a smart thing to do is to walk through like your day. Once you're on vacation, you say, all right, I get to my hotel room where I wake up in the morning. What am I going to do first? Do I brush my teeth? Do I have my toothbrush? Do I have my toothpaste, my floss, whatever? Then maybe I'll take a shower. Do I have what I need for that? Actually, the hotel will have that. Okay, that's fine. Right. Oh, but wait, there's a couple of hair products that I like to have. So I'll bring this. Right? Then eventually you go outside and you might think, all right, is it going to be raining when I go outside? Now that might not come to mind, but when you picture yourself like you're immersed in the 3D multisensory, and this, you don't have to see this vividly. If you're walking through, I like this illustration because when you walk through your day that you'd have if you were on a trip, you don't have to see in like full technicolor when you step outside out of the hotel, right? You don't have to feel every feeling, smell every smell, see every sight, but you get a sense of that scenario, right? What it's like to walk outside your hotel. And it's fairly likely that you'll realize that the weather could be different types of weather as you start to picture that, you see? So it's not about seeing every detail. It's not about seeing vividly or hearing vividly or smelling vividly, but having a general sense of the three-dimensionality of it, of the playing it through in time. Sometimes you look at things from multiple angles. Sometimes as you're doing a scenario, you might say, what if, right? What if I feel tired that day? Then maybe I want a book with me, right? What if I don't feel tired, right? So the what if means that you can have different timelines, so to speak, right? Different things. You're not just walking through one scenario and one timeline, but you can have things change based on you change one factor, you change another factor. So you can look at it with different senses, or at least just, but you're mimicking real life. In real life, you don't notice every sound, you don't see every sight, right? But you have a generally multisensory experience, potentially. Although sometimes you're only focused on what you're seeing, sometimes you're only focused on what you're hearing, but they're all potentially there for you. And then, but a scenario you can think, as I said, you can look at it from different angles, say, what if this, what if that? But then you walk through your whole day and you keep going, and what you need to bring will become obvious. And yet it wasn't obvious before you walk through the scenario in your mind. Whenever you run through scenarios, it'll make a certain thing easy that, again, wasn't happening before. Whether it was easy or not is not really relevant because your mind didn't notice or didn't output the list of what you needed properly. It left some things out. But then when you do the scenario, it outputs more properly. Good. Okay. So that probably helped you understand what I mean more by scenarios. That scenario type thinking is a important building block at the linchpin of accurate thinking, is to think in terms of scenarios. And then again, you can change a factor. What if this? What if that? You can do the same thing when having your goals reveal themselves or thinking what you'll do if something doesn't go as expected. James Clark says, do you believe there's a civil war that occurs between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind? If so, the idea of aligning our conscious with our subconscious should be an important goal. What, see, here you're a little bit projecting other people's ideas onto what we're talking about. It leads to a good kind of question where I can explain some stuff, but it can also be a little bit inefficient for you sometimes, and you can miss the simplicity of what I'm saying. A lot of the complexity of what I'm saying comes from your existing framework interfering with what I'm saying rather than else. That illustration I gave about the subconscious mind or the conscious mind just being like, look, some of your computer processing is involved with what's going on the screen and some isn't. The war comes from your mind. Luckily, you're asking me, and I know stuff that people generally don't realize, or a whole bunch of it. So I can actually explain this. Your mind gets its goals from standards and norms around you. Since that's the case, it's absorbing them from the outside. There's all sorts of contradictory goals that can get into your same mind because of it, right? Different standards and norms. Like, for example, you're a girl, just stereotypically, you grow up and your parents have certain standards and norms for you regarding sex. Then you're dating, and the adolescent guy that you're dating has different standards and norms coming from the powerful feelings and urges that he acts, right? So he's pressuring you one way, your parents are pressuring you another. Both standards and norms are having an effect on you, and you have different goals, right? Or you have, well, you don't want to disappoint him. You don't want to disappoint your parents. The civil war is not between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind. It's from different standards and norms that are absorbed. The way that you want to live your life is you want to gradually build, as fast as you can, but it's then gradually build what is correct in a kind of, using the correct process that I've talked about 2 webinars ago and so forth, and I'm always demonstrating. Then there's what you've discovered to be correct, and that is not going to have a civil war. If you understand it properly, when you build knowledge correctly, there's no war because it's unidirectional, like I talked about. It might be gradual. It might be very gradual sometimes, or it might be very quick. But when you figure out, you want to have an understanding of the world and thought and yourself and your mind, where you can develop, and knowledge, where you can develop ideas that you understand to be true because you can understand how the opposite of those ideas has to be wrong. You don't feel that those ideas are true necessarily. If you do, that's besides the point. Your feelings come from associations in your brain, which comes from your whole development and that you absorb from the outside world, which obviously has some incorrect ideas in it. Not all, but plenty of incorrect and conflicting ideas. So there's no civil war between the quarantine truths that you figure out correctly. There's just a unidirectional influence that those will have, again, either quickly or eventually on the rest of your mind. So that over time, your wiring, your default, which then determines your feelings of what's correct and what you feel like doing naturally and easily, will become more aligned with what's adaptive, useful, correct, etc. Okay. So that explains the Civil War and explains how we want to do things correctly. The whole subconscious conscious distinction is there's ways that it could be useful, but there's a lot more ways that it'll just mislead you and confuse you. So what I would do is put it aside for now and just focus on my model that I'm giving you and then worry about and then build the understanding of the subconscious later or after the simple model. It'll interfere with the kind of the correct potential simplicity that I have for you. Thank you. That would help me say some very useful things. So thank you, Jane. Maria said, I think a good example, my husband was late to pick me up at the airport. My mind was telling me I'm never getting home, never getting to the much needed state. Emotions came up with angry, upset. So I stepped back, recognized this as an old pattern, right? Obviously, there's something incorrect about saying no. Obviously, there's something incorrect about it when you're feeling bad. You don't need to feel bad about anything. That's not going to be. It can be good to feel the feeling so that you're aware of a contradiction within your mind. The progress for me is recognizing negative feelings and pausing, then asking questions or setting up scenarios. Hubby is lost. He doesn't do well driving in the city. He loves me. I'm always okay, safe, protected. Very cool. So I sat and wrote that out, set up scenarios, called my good friend that understands how to walk me out of these loops. As a result of recognizing that old pattern, I was able to relax and detach from this negative feeling. When he arrived, I just said, I missed you. I appreciate you picking me up. Oh, that's so dope. A great example of the brain thinking permanently screwed, but not, oh, exactly. And your brain got stuck. Whenever there's a negative feeling, your brain's getting stuck of any sort. And you unstuck it the proper way. And what you just did adds up in your life and makes your life so much easier. Because you do that with your business, you do it day in and day out with your relationship, with motivating yourself, all kinds of stuff. And the ripple effect is just stuff is easier and easier. You have your relationship with your husband takes less maintenance because you're not screwing it up. There's less bailing water out of the boat with your relationship when you don't do this. People say relationships are a lot of work. I don't have my relationship that I have with my wife is not a lot of work because there's not a lot of bailing water out. I do need to spend some time with her, but of course I generally want to. I generally want to very much. When I say generally want to, there might be rare times when I like particularly rather be doing something else just based on my feelings at the moment, but it's uncommon because also you can spot that coming and not set yourself up to feel that way. But and overall, of course, I love spending time with her and it's wonderful times and so forth. But yeah, when people say relationships are a lot of work, it's only if there's a leaky boat, then there's a lot of work bailing it out. I'm not claiming to be perfect, but you do this on a regular basis and there's just not a lot of taking on water. And then your life turns out, your business, you could set up your business, there's not a lot of leaky stuff. And so it's not a lot of the type of work where you're just bailing, like you're running in place kind of thing, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. Yeah. You remember when I referred to that with I got that from you. It was very helpful when you brought that up. Shama last webinar. And then you're also referring to something I said previously, LOI, focus on what you know and build from there. I have to admit, I'm still blurry on that for specific examples. The examples, like everything I say is an example, right? Like I'm constantly pointing out things you can know as building blocks. So I'll think about what you said and try to see if I can make a kind of a specifically address examples about basically I'll try to address what you're saying here in the future. Or possibly in the next webinar, probably the next webinar. I'm going to just read a few questions. I probably won't address many at this point. Adrian says, hi, David. I'm currently struggling with understanding conversion. I've listened to Alchemy about navigating categories, but it still feels like a black hole. Can you still give me a few distinctions? Yeah, let me give you a couple of things here. Okay, just to clarify, he says, I know the distinctions of those categories, but whenever I try to put it into writing, it reads badly and doesn't convert at all. Okay. Okay, so you're talking now about written conversion. One of the things that if you're really having trouble converting, again, this is something I might have said in the past, but you want to take a look at your traffic. You want to see if people that basically want what you're selling are reading what you're trying to sell. And then you need to find ways to notice what categories you're getting wrong, what things you're triggering in a person that's disqualifying you. When you're doing a written conversion focus, there's a general formula of problem, agitate, solve. In other words, you're stating the problem that you're going to solve with your product so that they notice the problem and they understand what problem you're addressing with your product. Agitate means you are getting into the problem a little bit, talking about the consequences of the problem, talking about how you've experienced the problem yourself, right? And what that was like. And then solve. You talk about how you found or created the solution to that problem. and how your obviously your product or your service addresses that problem. And then you make your offer. You want to show why your offer is worth the money. As you're doing that, you want to appear competent. You don't want to trigger a feeling like this guy's incompetent or desperate or anything like that. So those are some things to start with that they'll help if those are the bottlenecks, if those aren't your particular bottlenecks. Trying to think what other things. If you're talking to people that basically you want to have something where you stand out. There's a talk of like unique selling proposition. You don't have to be unique in the world, but you need to stand out. Not stand out. You want to stand alone. But the thing is, whoever's reading your pitch generally wants to, in one sense, they want to believe that you're the guy. Because how many sales letters do you want to read? Right? You're like, when you're reading a sales letter, on one sense, you're incentivized to believe that this is the product. The letter you're reading has the product that's going to solve your problem. So they have that incentive, or the wrong audience, right? So a little bit depends on how they arrive. If you're giving a sales pitch to people that didn't necessarily want to hear the sales pitch, but that's not usually the case with the written word, right? If someone's reading your sales letter in the first place, then right, you only read a sales letter because you're hoping that the service is going to be the one that you want. So you just need to be confident. You just need to make them want to believe that you will solve their problem, and then give them a justification why they're not stupid for believing you. So keep in mind, problem agitates style. Keep in mind, you don't want to trigger incompetence. Keep in mind, you want to be talking to people that are the right audience. They don't have to be starving for what you have, but they have to want what you have. And then also keep in mind, people can really screw this up. Just my 2-part formula as well, which is vision and then justification. They have to want to believe that your service will help them. Given that your service will cost them money, product will cost them money, then that's a disincentive for them to believe. Unless they already want it, and you'll cost them less money, right? But so you automatically, given that they're going to have to pay money, but they're trading. So I'm not saying it's a disincentive like it's a bad thing. I just mean that you have to deal with that. The incentive is that they're reading it in the first place. So they must want to be trading money in most cases, unless your thing is offered for free in other places. If they're looking to buy a solution to their problem, then they know they're going to trade money. So they just want to feel like that they want their problem solved. They want to envision their problem being solved, right? But help them. You know how I talk about when you take someone through a scenario, or yourself, that when you walk through the idea of you going on a trip and you're on the trip and you're trying to figure out what to bring, you'll think of things to bring in many cases that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. What that fact that you think of things you wouldn't have thought of otherwise proves is that a scenario brings to mind things that weren't there before. Even though it might be easy to bring them to mind with a scenario, they weren't being treated as input by the reader before. So make sure that you're giving people a scenario that involves the problem and then how nice it is for the problem to be solved. Because if you don't make the scenario for it, where they can envision it, that's why I say vision and justification. This, of course, relates to more than just written. This is any conversion I'm talking about. But the scenario thing so strongly relates to this important fact about conversion, is you need to ultimately get to the point where you understand, but then you feel this truth that until somebody envisions something in the right way, it's not an input for their brain. It's not being taken into account in the same way by their brain. Just the same way you might not remember what to bring. You might not remember what to bring on a trip until you walk through this scenario. Or you don't you don't dissolve the fear until you walk through the scenario of what you do after the thing that you fear happens. And then you triumph through it, you move through it. Even though it was easy once you went to the scenario, it was impossible beforehand. Or you're dating someone, they say, oh, I just can't picture us being together. They could have pictured you being together if you help paint that picture properly. And so then the question becomes, how do I paint a picture in a way that it doesn't lose the audience, right? You want to get good at talking to someone that you're dating or married to, even, where you help them envision you guys being happy in the future without it turning them off, without it, they're being like, what the hell you talk about? Or that's we are on board or something, right? You don't have to use the words picture such and such. You can just describe it happening to you and how nice it is that when it's solved, or it happening to another person, and then what the world looks like when it's solved. Paint the picture in an appropriate way. And I can't really necessarily describe how to do it naturally, but at least look to do it in a way that kind of is. There's an idea of open loops when it comes to conversion, where it's like a mystery novel. If you know who did it, then you're bored. If there's not like an open question that you're telling, and I do this okay. I do this sometimes, whenever I remember, whatever I do consistently, if I remember with my webinars, is if I tell you what question is the open question, what's the mystery we're looking to solve in this webinar, then it helps hold attention, of course. So having an open loop, you say, as you read this letter, you're going to answer the following question, right? You're going to see three ways that people get trapped, or three ways that people don't realize they can get traffic very efficiently, right? You say that up front, and you say you're going to get that as you do the letter. That's a bit of an open loop. That's kind of a simple, obvious example of an open loop. You can maybe do it even more elegantly, but so open loop, competent, problem, agitate, solve, separately vision, and then justification is you give them, once they can see the benefit. Oh, just like in dating. Once they can see the picture of you guys being happy, so that's a nice picture. So they need to then believe it's possible. Then you have a justification why that can happen. You say, yeah. And so then you need to give them a reason why they can believe it. And the reason doesn't have to be very strong. Once somebody wants to believe something, then you just give them a reason that they can swallow. But if you give them a reason that'll turn them off, that'll isn't believable, that doesn't work for them, then that'll break the thing. If they could picture you guys holding hands, being happy in 6 months, if you're dating someone, and then you say, because I'm such an awesome stud, that's why you're going to feel that way, that might break the rapport. But if you say, because we've been happy when we met, and I think we'll talk through things if something comes up, and we enjoy being together, that you maybe come up with better justifications, but at least that's something. Right. Julie says, separate, but Julie said, bottom line, don't trust your brain to run your life without your conscious involvement. Correct. Including when it gives you a feeling of total certainty. And the great thing about the distinguishing you and your brain is you can have a thought like, my brain is giving me a full feeling of certainty without feeling like you are certain. Julie said, love that there's been so much in this session that can be practically applied. Oh, I'm glad that was the case. I wasn't sure if that was the case, but I'm glad. Of course, ultimately, I think this can be applied absolutely, very practically, but I don't know how well I communicate that. So in the doing, we can both look for bottleneck and consolidate any breakthroughs. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, especially in the discussion. We tend to do that. 10 million. From alchemy when I said 10 million. Wayne says, as I've always downloaded and listened to the first 7, 4, and 5 golden breakthroughs. Oh, I'm so glad. 4 and 5 really worked for you. But so glad to be here with 10 million Mills live. I'm glad you're here too. It's nice to have people live, of course. Megan Lee said, David's recent talk about the growing and sticky framework is a huge help for me when learning new things, like ClickFunnels and affiliate sites. I actually sketch out the framework and hang things on it. Great visual. Oh, that's so cool. That was in number 7, the previous webinar, the one before this from last week. 9 days ago, Joanne. Wonderful, guys. Brian says, David, your webbing tonight is blended literally with thunderous booms and rolling thunder. Oh, like literally the weather. Very auspicious. Thank you for sharing. That's a nice soundtrack for you to have in the background. Janine says, I'm not sure how to adequately express my gratitude to you. Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing everything you do with us. Thanks for what I've learned from you. I believe in God again after years of not being able to do so. That's so nice. Tonight, while you were talking, I finally had another breakthrough about a huge personal dilemma. It is such a relief to me, and I appreciate having the opportunity to keep learning. Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, I don't always know what to apply things to, but yeah, whenever you yourself can apply things, I think working on that, that's terrific. What is there, a page that has? I'm coming up with this picture. I didn't know I even had this picture on the internet. Maybe Mike could. I don't mind, but apparently there's a page with me and my Rolls Royce. I didn't plan that on purpose. Mike took that. Good picture. Okay, I better wind things down now. Wonderful stuff. Thank you for all your wonderful participation, everything typed in here. It's amazing how much you guys participated. So great. Yeah, just that kind of mantra, just that idea. I'm not my brain or body. I know I've gotten so many reports from people that help them a lot. I think even like a basic understanding of it really helps people to not identify or get so wrapped up with their thoughts. And of course, especially negative thoughts, they're difficult. There's two really, like particularly, there's almost infinite in one sense, but like two particular applications are when you're really getting messed with your mind, right? Just really messing with you in some way. really feeling depressed or not motivated or something and not totally buying into that. And then the other is an ideal of even if you don't feel being messed with, you don't feel any pain at the moment, but you can examine something that your mind feels like totally certain of and still break out of it because you realize you really need to change the game, even if there's not like a lot of, again, not, it's great if we can figure out some place that we're stuck without having to feel a lot of, right? Because if you're getting out of the box and growing and discovering without having to feel a lot of pain or having to crash and burn first, then you can often catch things before you have to feel a lot of pain or crash and burn. And I, of course, anyone can have a disaster, and I certainly can in the future, but I really just don't have a lot of pain or difficulty in my life and for a long time running now. But I really work at trying to catch things ahead of time. Not even catching like a thing that would exactly trip me out, but just looking to discover stuff, right? About what's important and what's true. And so when you don't need like a lot of problems to wake you up, then I find you, at least for myself, I don't really have a lot of problems that I have to run into. I don't know whether that's like it could be like a particularly good stream of good luck. And again, I could certainly hit a disaster. And that doesn't mean that it's not always our fault, right? I could hit one that's my fault in the sense that I didn't catch something, but in the sense that there's a problem, an issue in my mind still and that I haven't fixed and it leads to a real problem. Or there could just be an environmental thing that isn't having to do with my mind, but just, but anyway, one way or the other, just not a lot of pain or problems by not needing those in order to need really be looking to grow and learn and discover what's wrong in my mind and so forth. Oh, and not just that I don't have a lot of problems or bad things happen to me currently, but I discover a lot, right? Like I discover a lot of mistakes or things that, or clarity, where it wasn't exactly a mistake, but I have clarity about something important where because of the lack of clarity in the past, I would sometimes not do things ideally. And I discover a lot of things without needing the pain to do right because I want to discover anyway without the pain. And then it ends up not having to happen. Maria says, I'm truly grateful for your webinars. It vitally helps with building a proper framework moving forward. You're a special gift to us all. Thank you so much, Maria. I appreciate it. So nice to you guys. Like the bailing water out of relationship boat metaphor. Yep. Megan, got to remember that next time I have buttons are pushed. It's not worth the resources needed to bail all that mucky. Exactly. Thanks, David, for another foothold in choppy waters. You're welcome. You're welcome, Adrian. That gives me a lot of stuff to start working on. Good with the conversion question. Wonderful. Especially walking through a scenario gives me a lot of foothold. Good. That might be something you're missing. You might not have that scenario in what you're saying. You might just talk without like metaphorical or parallel to thinking, oh, I need this for the trip. I need that for the trip. But you never walk through the actual scenario. Maybe that's lacking in your writing, which is a little bit different than a story. You don't really necessarily need to tell a story. What you need to do is walk through a scenario generally. And I know that it's not entirely clear exactly when I say walk through a scenario, but even trying to apply it will probably work for you, even if, and I'll constantly look to explain that better. You're very welcome, Chad. Very welcome, James. Very welcome, Susanna. I'm getting some things I've struggled with my whole life. It's so profound that it feels overwhelming. That's so nice, Susanna. It seems like a really good, nice ongoing process for the last several weeks or months. Wonderful. Great to hear. Already another great webinar. Wonderful. You're welcome, Robbie and Julie and everyone. Thanks, guys, again for your wonderful sentiments and discussion. You're very welcome, Brian. Take care. All.